When the gun smoke cleared over the Tugfork River, one Hatfield lay dead on the ferry landing, put there by another. The killer wasn't some long-hated McCoy. He was the law itself, Sheriff Bud Hatfield, and the man bleeding out in the dirt was his own cousin. This single act raises a chilling question that echoes through the hollows to this day. How does a man forged in the fires of the Hatfield feud, a clan that valued blood above all else, bring himself to kill his own family for a tin star? The newspapers of the day called it justice. But those who lived in the shadows of the mountains whispered a different story. A story of a kinslayer, a man who made a deal with the devil, a traitor who sold his soul. Today, we will separate the facts from the folklore to find the truth behind the most feared and complicated lawman in Appalachian history. To understand the man, you have to understand the silence that fell after the storm. By the turn of the 20th century, the great Hatfield-McCoy feud was over. The shooting had mostly stopped. The famous raids were now just stories told to wide-eyed children. But the peace was a fragile, wounded thing. It was a land of long memories and short tempers, where a man's last name was more important than any law written in a book. The Tugfork Valley was a world unto itself, a labyrinth of creeks and hollows where families lived by codes carved into their very bones over generations. Justice wasn't found in a courthouse. It was settled in a cornfield, on a riverbank, or at the dark end of a lonely mountain path. In this world of simmering grudges lived William Anderson Hatfield, known to all as Bud. He was not a patriarch like his famous cousin, Devil Anse. He was a younger man, molded by the feud's final bloody years. He had seen the cost of hot-blooded pride firsthand. While his kin were known for their booming laughs and explosive tempers, Bud was different. He was quiet, watchful. He moved through the woods not like a man, but like a shadow, his eyes missing nothing. He didn't boast of his skill with a pistol. He simply practiced, hour after hour, until the Colt revolver felt like an extension of his own hand. He learned the mountains as a hunter, but he wasn't just tracking deer. He was learning how men think when they're being hunted, where they hide when they're scared, and the fatal mistakes they make when they believe they're safe. He was absorbing the brutal lessons of the feud, not as a brawler, but as a student of violence. He was a weapon being forged in the quiet aftermath of a war, waiting for a purpose. His world was one of clan loyalty, where the only thing that mattered was protecting your own, no matter the cost. But a new sound was beginning to echo through the mountains, a sound louder than a rifle shot. It was the chugging of steam engines and the grinding of machinery. Coal companies with their fat checkbooks and their armies of private detectives from agencies like Baldwin Felts were pushing their way into the hills. They saw the mountains not as a home, but as a treasure chest to be cracked open. They brought with them a new kind of law, corporate law, and they had no patience for the old ways of the clans. The world that had created Bud Hatfield was about to be devoured, and he would soon have to make a choice that no Hatfield had ever faced. The conflict that would define Bud Hatfield's life didn't begin with a single gunshot. Its seeds were planted generations before, deep in the rocky Appalachian soil. The Hatfields, like many of the Scots-Irish families who first dared to cross the mountains, carved a kingdom for themselves, not with a pen and a deed, but with an axe and a long rifle. This land wasn't just property. It was their lifeblood, their fortress, and their identity. They owed allegiance to no distant government. They were kings of their own hollows, and they held their land with a fierce, possessive grip that outsiders could never understand. The deepest scar on this landscape was the Civil War. While the nation tore itself apart, the borderlands between West Virginia and Kentucky became a brutal theater of guerrilla warfare. The Hatfields were fiercely Confederate, seeing the Union as an invading force trying to impose its will upon them. Devil Anse himself led a band of irregulars, the Logan Wildcats, who fought a vicious war in the hills long after the main armies had gone home. They weren't just fighting for a political cause. They were fighting for their own sovereignty against any and all outside control. This deep-seated division bled directly into the Hatfield-McCoy feud. At its heart, it was a continuation of the war on a more personal scale, with the largely Confederate Hatfields pitted against the largely Unionist McCoys. The conflict was fueled by old loyalties and betrayals that the rest of the country was trying to forget. For these families, the war never ended. It simply smoldered under the surface, waiting for any spark, a stolen pig, a forbidden romance, to erupt into a full-blown inferno. In this world, a family name was everything. It was a heavy cloak of obligation and pride worn from birth. And to be a Hatfield meant you lived by an unwritten, unbreakable code. It meant you stood by your kin, right or wrong. It meant you settled your own scores, answered insults with your fists or your gun, and never backed down from a fight. Above all, it meant you never, ever turned to an outside lawman for justice, and you certainly never became one. The law was the enemy, the outsider, the threat to the clan's power. This was the legacy Bud Hatfield was born into, a legacy of fierce independence, deep suspicion, and a sworn duty to put blood before all else. The end of the feud didn't bring unity. It left a vacuum. With no common enemy to fight, the old clans began to turn on themselves. The Tugfork Valley became a tangled web of personal slights and simmering resentments. The supporting cast wasn't just Hatfield and McCoy anymore. It was the Hatfields who sold timber rights to the coal companies versus the Hatfields who refused. It was the families who wanted schools and roads versus the families who saw every change as an invasion. It was a community teetering on a knife's edge, where everyone was watching everyone else, waiting for the first sign of weakness or betrayal. At the center of the old guard's resistance was Bud's own cousin, another Elias Hatfield, but this one went by a different name, Bad Lias. He was everything the old Hatfields were supposed to be, wild, violent, and utterly contemptuous of any law but his own. He drank, he brawled, and he took what he wanted. While Devil Anse was growing old and making calculated deals with the coal barons, Bad Lias was a living, breathing reminder of the clan's lawless past. He was a festering wound, a source of both pride and shame for the family, and his violent exploits kept the old animosities burning bright. The air itself grew thick with gossip. On the porch of the general store, men would speak in low tones about which Hatfield was seen talking to a Baldwin Felts man. Women would whisper over their washboards, speculating on who was behind a mysterious fire that burned a small logging operation. The McCoys and their allies, though quiet, were watching with hungry eyes. They saw the cracks forming in the great Hatfield dynasty and knew that a house divided against itself could not stand. Every fistfight, every land dispute, every drunken threat was fuel for a fire that had never truly been extinguished. This was a world where suspicion was a survival tool. A friendly wave from a man whose grandfather fought for the Union might be a genuine greeting, or it might be a trick to get a better look at the rifle you were carrying. A business deal gone sour wasn't a civil matter. It was a mortal insult that could lead to an ambush on a lonely stretch of road. It was a poison that seeped into the wells, turning neighbor against neighbor and cousin against cousin. The community wasn't healing. It was rotting from the inside out with paranoia and fear. And into this poisonous air, a new rumor began to spread, one more unbelievable than all the others. That Bud Hatfield, the quiet one, the dead shot, was thinking of doing the unthinkable. In the months before Bud Hatfield pinned on his badge, the old folks said the mountains themselves seemed to hold their breath. The air went still and heavy, the way it does before a lightning strike tears the sky open. A hoot owl, that feathered messenger of death, was heard crying in broad daylight near the Hatfield family graveyard. Men hunting deep in the woods came back with stories of feeling unseen eyes on their backs, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the bears or panthers that roamed the hills. The very land seemed to be sending a warning, whispering through the rustling leaves that the old world was dying and its ghost would not go peacefully. The human omen was far less subtle. Strangers began appearing in the hollows, men with clean hands and cold eyes, carrying surveyors' transits and leather briefcases full of contracts. They were the agents of the coal and timber companies, and they moved with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. They spoke of progress and prosperity, but their eyes measured the ancient trees in board feet and sized up the family homesteads by the tons of coal that lay beneath them. Their presence was a constant, grating reminder that the outside world was no longer content to leave the mountains alone. They were a walking, talking prophecy of a new kind of war, one fought not with rifles over family honor, but with lawyers and hired guns over mineral rights. Bud Hatfield, a man who read the woods better than any book, felt this change in his gut. It was a coiled tightness in the air, a new kind of fear in the eyes of his neighbors. He saw men who had once been proud and defiant, now speaking in hushed tones, worried about losing the very land their grandfathers had bled for. He saw the easy smiles of the company men and recognized the look of a predator sizing up its prey. He felt a deep, chilling premonition that the old Hatfield code of settling their own problems and protecting their own kin was no longer enough. It was a code designed for fighting other mountain men, not for fighting a corporation with limitless money and its own private army. Something terrible was coming, and Bud knew, with the certainty of a hunter sensing a shift in the wind, that he was standing directly in its path. The law in Logan County had become a ghost. It haunted the courthouse, but it held no power in the hollows. The chaos that Bud Hatfield had foreseen was no longer a distant storm. It was a flood. Drunken brawls turned into shootouts in broad daylight. Payrolls for the coal mines were robbed on the open road. Witnesses to crimes would suddenly lose their memory, their silence bought by a quiet threat delivered on their doorstep in the dead of night. The old system of clan justice was crumbling, and the new corporate law of the Baldwin Felts agents was nothing more than organized brutality, serving only the interests of the coal barons. The county was bleeding, and there was no one to stop it. It was in this desperate atmosphere that the county officials made their move. They needed a man who could not be intimidated, who knew the mountains and the mindset of the men who haunted them. They needed a man who was feared more than the outlaws themselves. And so, they came to the one man who fit that description perfectly. They came to Bud Hatfield. The offer was laid on the table, a deputy's badge. It wasn't a job offer, it was a plea. They weren't asking him to be a peacekeeper. They were asking him to be a hunter, a one-man army who could walk into the darkest hollows and drag the violence out into the light. For Bud, this was the moment the world stopped. To accept the badge was to turn his back on everything he had ever known. It was a declaration that the code of the Hatfields, the sacred bond of blood, was no longer his law. He was choosing the law of strangers over the blood of his grandfather. He looked at the chaos around him, at men like his cousin Bad Lears, who were becoming rabid dogs, and at the cold-eyed company thugs who were no better. He saw two paths leading to the same ruin, and in that moment he chose a third. With a steady hand, he reached out and took the small piece of tin. He pinned it to his chest. The word spread through the hollows like a pestilence. A Hatfield was the law. To his family, it was the ultimate betrayal. Whispers of traitor followed him like a shadow. Uncles and cousins who had known him since birth now looked at him with a mixture of fear and contempt. The community was instantly and violently divided. You were either for the old ways or you stood with the kinslayer. There was no middle ground. This was the first drop of blood. It wasn't spilled by a bullet, but by an oath. By pinning on that badge, Bud Hatfield had drawn a line not on a map, but through the heart of his own family. From that moment on, he was no longer just Bud Hatfield. He was Deputy Hatfield. And for men like his cousin, Bad Lears, who saw the badge as a declaration of war, it made him a target. The confrontation was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability. The confrontation was inevitable, and it happened, as so many things in that country do, by the river. Bud Hatfield and his posse cornered his cousin, Bad Lears, at the ferry landing. The water of the tug fork was slow and brown, the air thick with tension. It wasn't a long standoff. There were no grand speeches. There was only the low, steady voice of Sheriff Hatfield ordering his own blood to surrender, and the wild, defiant laugh of Bad Lias in response. For a moment, the two men stood as living symbols of the two worlds colliding, the old, lawless clan and the new, iron-willed law. What happened next took less time than a single breath, but the silence it created would last forever. There was no Hollywood gunfight, no men diving for cover. There was only a sudden, blurred movement, and then the calm was shattered by a deafening roar that echoed off the water and slammed into the hills. It was followed almost instantly by a second shot, so close to the first they sounded like a single stuttered clap of thunder. The posse froze, their own guns still in their holsters. When the sharp, acrid smell of gun smoke cut through the damp air, Bad Lias was no longer standing. He was on his knees, his head bowed, looking not at his cousin, but down at the wooden planks of the landing. He stayed that way for a single, long second, a statue of defeat. Then, without a sound, he simply pitched forward, his fall making a dull, hollow thud that seemed shockingly loud in the sudden quiet. From across the river, a person would have seen almost nothing. Just two men facing each other, a puff of white smoke quickly stolen by the breeze, and then one man falling. They would not have seen any blood. They would only have seen a dark stain begin to slowly spread across the back of the fallen man's shirt, like a shadow growing in the afternoon sun. The true horror wasn't in the wound, but in the stillness that followed. Bud Hatfield walked forward, his boots making heavy, deliberate sounds on the ferry landing. He stood over the body of his kinsman, his own pistol still smoking in his hand. The pearl handle, they say, felt as cold as a river stone against his palm. He did not speak. He did not offer a prayer. He simply looked down at what the law had required of him. Members of the posse would later whisper that the most terrifying part was the look in Sheriff Hatfield's eyes. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't remorse. It was a chilling, empty calm, the look of a man who had just performed a necessary but terrible piece of work. A Hatfield had killed a Hatfield. In that moment, the old world of clan justice didn't just die. It was executed on a riverbank by one of its own sons. To understand what went through Bud Hatfield's mind on that ferry landing, you must first understand that he likely didn't see himself as a killer. He saw himself as a surgeon. In his cold, calculated view, his cousin, Bad Lias, wasn't a man anymore. He was a disease. He was the living embodiment of the chaos and violence that was strangling the mountains, the very sickness that Bud had sworn an oath to cure. His twisted logic was terrifyingly simple. To save the body, you must cut out the cancer. In that moment, the bond of blood was meaningless. It was an old-world sentiment that had no place in the new order he was trying to build. He wasn't executing his cousin. He was executing a problem. The true transformation didn't happen in the flash of gunfire. It happened in the quiet moment he first pinned the badge to his chest. That act was a silent vow to kill the part of himself that was a Hatfield clansman. He had to consciously sever the ties of blood and tradition that had defined his entire life. To become Sheriff Hatfield, Bud Hatfield, the cousin, had to die. So when Bad Lias made his move, there was no internal struggle. There was no hesitation. The switch had been flipped months ago. He was no longer acting as a man, but as an instrument of the law he had chosen to serve, and instruments do not feel conflict. As he drew his pistol, the world would have narrowed to a single point, the threat in front of him. His years of relentless practice took over, his mind becoming a place of chilling calm. There was no anger, no hatred, not even a flicker of sadness for the boy he once knew. There was only a target, a distance, and a trigger to be pulled. It was the detached, predatory focus of a hunter, but his prey was his own family. He was operating on a level of pure, brutal efficiency that few men could comprehend, let alone achieve. And afterward, standing in the gun smoke over his cousin's body, he would not have felt triumph or relief. He would have felt a profound and chilling emptiness. It was the quiet that comes after a storm has passed, the silence of a void created where something used to be. He had proven his loyalty to the law, but the price was a piece of his own soul. He had become what the county needed him to be, a monster to hunt monsters, but in doing so, he had become a stranger to his own kin and perhaps even to himself. The legend of the fearless lawman was born in that moment, but so was the ghost of the kinslayer that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The silence that fell on the ferry landing was heavier than a tombstone. Bud Hatfield's posse stood frozen, men who had seen their share of violence now stunned into stillness, not by the death, but by the identity of the killer and the killed. Sheriff Hatfield broke the spell. His voice was flat, devoid of any emotion, as if he were cataloguing supplies. He gave orders to secure the body and retrieve his cousin's weapon. He treated the scene with the cold, methodical procedure of a man clearing away a fallen tree from a road. There was no room for grief or hesitation. The law had been served, and now the paperwork had to follow. The body of Bad Lias was brought back to town, laid out on the back of a wagon. That grim procession was the only announcement needed. The news didn't travel by wire. It moved like a ghost, whispered from porch to porch, from one hollow to the next. A Hatfield has killed a Hatfield. The words carried a terrible weight, a sacrilege against the deepest code of the mountains. It was a wound cut into the very soul of the clan, a wound that would fester and poison everything it touched. For the Hatfield family, it was a moment of profound and terrible clarity. The lines were drawn. Doors that had always been open to Bud were now silently, permanently barred. Eyes that once held kinship now held a cold, hard judgment. They did not raise their guns against him, not yet. Their reaction was a silence more menacing than any threat. He was no longer one of them. He was an outsider, a tool of the very government they had fought for generations. He was a kinslayer. In the eyes of his own blood, his badge was not a symbol of honor, but the brand of a traitor. The official reaction was the polar opposite. The county prosecutor reviewed Bud's report, a document as blunt and efficient as the man who wrote it. It was a lawful killing. Bad Lias had resisted arrest. He had drawn his weapon. The men of the posse, shaken but loyal to their sheriff, corroborated the story. The officials who had hired Bud let out a collective sigh of relief. They had unleashed a force of nature, and it was working. He had done the unthinkable, the very thing no one else had the stomach to do. They saw a hero, a man bringing order through righteous, necessary violence. His power was solidified, his legend cemented in the halls of the courthouse. But for Bud, the hunt was just beginning. It was not a hunt for another outlaw, but a lifelong hunt for a peace he would never find. He had made his choice, and now he had to live in the world he had created, a world where he was feared by all and trusted by none. The ashes of his old life were all around him, the family he had forsaken, the traditions he had shattered. He was the law, but he was utterly alone, a solitary figure standing in the chilling silence that follows the final, fatal shot. The killing of Bad Lias split the county like a bolt of lightning hitting a 100-year-old oak. There was no middle ground left, no place for neutrality. Every single person, from the coal baron in his fine house to the farmer scratching a living from a rocky hillside, was forced to choose. The general store became a silent battlefield. A man's loyalty could be judged by who he tipped his hat to and whose gaze he avoided. A woman buying flour would fall silent if a known supporter of the sheriff walked in, the friendly chatter dying as if a cold wind had blown through the room. It was a war fought with averted eyes, tight-lipped smiles, and doors that suddenly wouldn't open. An unspoken conspiracy of silence descended upon the hills. Many knew the official story of the shooting was too clean, too simple. They'd heard whispers of a different tale, that Bad Lias was trying to surrender, that the second shot was unnecessary. But who would dare say so? To speak against Sheriff Hatfield was to invite a visit in the dead of night. People who had once been proud and outspoken now looked at their own children and chose to hold their tongues. Fear was a more effective lawman than Bud Hatfield could ever be, and it kept the community locked in a state of terrified paralysis. The truth, whatever it was buried alive under the weight of that silence. But even in the deepest fear, there were small acts of courage and cowardice that revealed the true heart of the people. A merchant, once a friend of Bad Leah's, now made a point to give Sheriff Hatfield a discount, a public display of his newfound allegiance. A preacher, caught between his fear of the lawman and his fear of God, delivered a sermon on the sin of Cain that was so full of careful, veiled language that both sides could claim it as their own. Then there were the quiet acts of defiance. An old woman from a distant branch of the Hatfield family walked 10 miles to lay a single wildflower on Bad Leah's unmarked grave. A miner, his face black with coal dust, was heard to mutter "Kinslayer" as Bud rode past, a single word of rebellion that could have cost him his life. And the McCoys, the old enemies, they said nothing at all. They just watched, their silence one of grim satisfaction as their great rival, the House of Hatfield, began to devour itself from within. The death of Bad Leah's was not an end, it was a declaration. With that single act, Sheriff Bud Hatfield had served notice to every outlaw, moonshiner, and hot-blooded brawler in the county. The old ways were over. His posse was no longer made of Hatfield cousins riding to defend the clan's honor. It was a new breed of man. They were young, grim-faced deputies who owed their loyalty not to a family name, but to the paycheck and the terrifying man who signed it. They followed him into the darkest hollows, not out of camaraderie, but out of a deep-seated fear of what he would do to them if they refused. They knew they were not his kin, they were his tools. The hunt for fugitives under Sheriff Hatfield became a new kind of Appalachian horror story. He didn't send his deputies, he led them. And when he went into the mountains, he was no longer a lawman. He was a predator returning to his natural habitat. The very skills the feud had taught him, how to track a man through dense rhododendron thickets, how to read a footprint in a creek bed, how to move through the woods without making a sound, were now turned against the very people who lived by that same code. The mountains that had for generations served as a fortress for the clans, hiding them from the outside world, had now become Bud Hatfield's personal hunting preserve. When a warrant was issued, a chilling game of cat and mouse began. The fugitive would run to the hills, believing himself safe in the familiar terrain. But he wasn't just being chased, he was being stalked. Bud was relentless, a force of nature that did not sleep or tire. Men on the run would tell stories of going days without seeing him, only to find the ashes of a campfire still warm, just 100 yards from where they had slept. They would hear a branch snap in the dead of night and know, with a certainty that chilled their blood, that it wasn't a deer. The psychological toll was immense. They weren't just running from the law, they were running from a ghost who knew every secret trail and every hidden cave. The moment of capture was rarely a chaotic firefight. More often, it was a scene of terrifying quiet. After days of being worn down by exhaustion and paranoia, the cornered man would look up to see Bud Hatfield standing at the edge of his camp, a Colt revolver held loosely at his side. He wouldn't shout or make demands. He would just stand there, his eyes flat and cold, his presence promising a swift and final violence if the wrong choice was made. Faced with that unflinching, predatory stare, most men simply gave up. Hardened killers who had sworn they'd never be taken alive would slowly raise their hands, their will to fight completely broken. They understood in that silent moment that they were not facing a man, but a reckoning. The hunt would end not with a bang, but with the quiet click of handcuffs, a sound that signaled the total and absolute surrender of the old world to the new law of the mountains. The Logan County Courthouse, once a sleepy building of legal debate, transformed under Bud Hatfield's reign. It became a theater of fear. When the sheriff brought a prisoner to trial, the room was packed not with curious onlookers, but with a silent, tense audience of clan members and enemies, all watching each other. Armed deputies, loyal only to Bud, stood at every exit, their presence a constant, unspoken threat. The air was thick with a tension that had nothing to do with legal arguments. It was the ancient tension of the mountains, of blood feuds and violent retribution, now brought indoors and wrapped in the thin veneer of official procedure. The trials themselves became a grim formality. The defendants Bud brought in didn't swagger or boast. They stood before the judge with the hollow-eyed look of a cornered animal that has already accepted its fate. Their real trial hadn't happened in the courtroom. It had occurred days earlier in a dark hollow at the end of a relentless manhunt when they looked up and saw Bud Hatfield emerge from the trees. By the time they reached the courthouse, their spirit was already broken. Their reaction was not one of defiance, but of quiet, defeated submission. Even the sharpest lawyers learned a new set of rules. You did not aggressively cross-examine Sheriff Hatfield. You did not challenge his account of the arrest. To do so was to imply he was a liar, and you could feel the temperature in the room drop when it happened. Witnesses for the prosecution spoke with a newfound clarity, while those for the defense often found their memories grew foggy under the weight of the sheriff's quiet, unblinking stare from the front row. It wasn't jury tampering in the traditional sense, it was an atmosphere of pure, suffocating intimidation. The verdicts, when they came, were swift and almost always the same: guilty. The conviction rate in Logan County skyrocketed. The payroll robberies stopped. The open brawling ceased. On paper, it was a staggering success. The law of men, with its procedures and its juries, was finally working. But a chilling question hung over every conviction, whispered on the courthouse steps after the prisoner had been dragged away in chains. Was this truly justice? Or had Bud Hatfield simply brought the old ways of the mountains inside the courthouse walls? He had not replaced the clan's code with the state's law. He had merged them into something new and terrifying. He used the tools of the state, the badge, the courts, the prisons, to enforce his own absolute, iron-willed version of mountain justice. The mastermind of it all was Bud himself, and he was never on trial. He was the judge, jury, and executioner long before any gavel fell. The people of Logan County had order, but many wondered if they had sacrificed justice to get it. After the trials were over and the jail cells were full, the Hatfield clan did not declare open war on their cousin. They did something far colder, far more final. They simply erased him. He became a ghost in his own family tree, a name spoken only in whispers of contempt. To the world, he was the powerful Sheriff Hatfield, but to the people who shared his blood, he was a dead man walking. The price for his iron-fisted order was a profound and permanent exile. He had brought the law to the mountains, but in the process, he had lost his home. Bud's life became a strange paradox. He was the most powerful man in the county, yet he was also the most alone. He walked the streets of Logan, a solitary king, his throne built on fear, and his kingdom populated by subjects who hated him. The justice he escaped in the courthouse found him in the shadows. Attempts on his life became a regular occurrence. A rifle shot that echoed from a distant ridge, narrowly missing his head. A stick of dynamite found under a bridge he was about to cross. He survived them all, his uncanny instincts and sheer, stubborn meanness keeping death at bay. But it was a life lived on a razor's edge, a constant grinding war of attrition. The mountains themselves seemed to hold a grudge, and every rustling leaf, every snapping twig was a potential threat. He was not a lawman. He was a warden in a prison of his own making. Whether he was truly haunted by the ghost of Bad Lias, as the campfire tales claimed, is a question that lies buried with him. But those who knew him in his later years described a man hollowed out from the inside. The chilling calm he displayed at the ferry landing became his permanent state. The silence around him wasn't just a result of the fear he inspired, it was a reflection of the silence within his own soul. He had made a deal to bring order, but the cost was a lifetime of looking over his shoulder, of seeing his cousin's face in the eyes of every man he arrested, and of knowing that the blood he spilled could never be washed away. This was his true sentence, not a curse from a ghost, but the relentless atonement of a man living with the consequences of an unforgivable choice. As the years passed, and Bud's era of iron rule eventually faded, the community did what communities do after a great trauma. It chose to forget. It was easier to talk about the Hatfield-McCoy feud, a distant, almost romantic conflict, than to speak of the time when a Hatfield hunted Hatfields. The story was too raw, too close, a mirror that showed a reflection of themselves they did not want to see. The tale of Sheriff Bud Hatfield, the kinslayer who brought order, was buried under new roads, new coal mines, and a thick, heavy blanket of willful silence. Today, the name Hatfield is known across the world, often romanticized as a symbol of rugged Appalachian defiance. Tourists flock to see the statue of Devil Anse, the great patriarch, standing proudly in a family cemetery. But there is no statue for Sheriff Bud Hatfield. For his descendants, the inheritance is a far more complicated thing. They carry a name associated not with a legendary feud, but with a kinslaying. It's a legacy of uncomfortable silence, a chapter of the family history that is rarely spoken of, a ghost that still lingers at the edge of family gatherings. The physical traces of his reign are faint, like old scars on the land. The courthouse in Logan may have been replaced by a newer building, but the spot where it stood remains a symbol of his absolute power, a place where the law of men was bent to the will of one man. But the true monument to his legacy is unmarked, and it lies on a quiet stretch of the Tug Fork River. There is no plaque, no cross to mark the spot where Bad Lias fell. It is just an ordinary ferry landing, a place where the slow brown water slips past the banks, holding its secrets close. It is a place of profound and terrible memory, hiding in plain sight. The official records of his arrests and the newspaper articles praising his efficiency still exist, gathering dust in archives. But the true story of Sheriff Hatfield is no longer found in books. It has seeped back into the soil from which it came, becoming a piece of folklore. It lives on in the quiet conversations of old men on their porches, a cautionary tale told to grandsons about the danger of putting a badge before blood and the terrible price of absolute order. The coal mines have scarred the hills, new roads have been paved over the old horse trails, and the world has moved on. The people have forgotten, or perhaps have chosen to forget the specifics of that dark time. But the mountains have not. They were the silent witnesses to it all, to the oath, the hunt, and the final fatal shot on the riverbank. The mountains remember everything. So we return to the question that hung in the air like gun smoke on that fateful day. How does a Hatfield bring himself to kill a Hatfield for a tin star? The simple answer is that he didn't. Bud Hatfield wasn't fighting for the law of the state. He was fighting for his own brutal vision of survival. He saw a world of chaos and blood that was being devoured by an even greater predator, the coal companies and their armies of hired guns. He believed the old ways of the clan were a sentimental weakness, a path to extinction. So he made a terrible choice. He became a monster to save the mountains from other monsters, sacrificing his own family and his own soul in the process. This is a story not just of one complicated man, but of the brutal, heartbreaking bargain Appalachia was forced to make. It's a story about what happens when the forces of the modern world come for a land steeped in tradition, blood, and honor. Bud Hatfield is the personification of that collision. He was the iron will that brought order, but it was the order of the gallows, the peace of the graveyard. His life is a testament to the fact that sometimes the man who claims to be bringing civilization is more savage than the wilderness he is trying to tame. So the next time you hear the name Hatfield and you think of the famous feud, I want you to remember this story. Remember the man who was both a lawman and a kinslayer, a hero and a traitor, a savior and a beast. He was a man forged in the crucible of the mountains, who then used that fire to burn away the very world that created him, leaving behind nothing but the cold ashes of order. And now, my friends, Another one of these forgotten stories has been told. They say that on the night Talton Hall died, the mountains themselves held their breath. This wasn't a death in a blaze of glory, not a gunfight between two men in a dusty street. This was something colder. This was a mob, silent and determined, dragging a shackled man from a train car. This was the end of the line for the man they called the Pikeville Killer, the Mountain Demon, his fate sealed not by a judge's gavel, but by a rope thrown over the branch of a maple tree. How does a man become so feared that his death becomes a legend? Was he a simple monster, a killer for hire who finally ran out of road? Or was he something more complex, a perfect, brutal product of a lawless time? To understand what happened on that September night in 1892, we have to go back. We have to trace the bloody path that led Talton Hall from the anonymous hollows of Kentucky to his final, haunting dance at the end of a rope. To understand the man, you have to understand the mountains that made him. Talton Hall was born around 1846 into a world that was already old, a world of deep hollows and interlocking ridges that separated families from the law, from the government, and from each other. In these parts of eastern Kentucky, a man's world was as big as he could walk in a day, and his only true allegiance was to his kin. Justice wasn't something you found in a courthouse, it was something you took with a rifle in your hands. This was the soil where a man like Hall would take root. The great bloody catalyst of his life was the Civil War. For the rest of America, it was a war of armies and grand campaigns. But in the Cumberland Mountains, it was a poison that seeped into every creek and holler. It was a war of bushwhackers and home guards, where your neighbor might be a secret enemy and a knock on the door at night could mean death. Young Talton came of age in this furnace. He would have seen men hanged for their loyalties, families burned out of their homes, and vendettas born that would fester for generations. This is where he learned his first, and perhaps only, lesson. The world is a brutal place, and the only certainty is the man who is quicker on the draw. When the war ended on paper, it didn't end in the mountains. The soldiers came home, but they brought the war with them. They were men skilled in the art of ambush, tracking and killing, skills that didn't have much use in a peaceful world. But their world wasn't peaceful. Old grudges from the war now mixed with new disputes over land, timber, and politics. This chaotic, violent landscape became a job market for men who had a talent for death. The code of the mountains was built on honor. You defended your family, you avenged insults, and you never ever backed down from a fight. It was a harsh code, but it had its own logic. For Talton Hall, this code seems to have been stripped of its heart, leaving only the cold mechanics of violence. He saw that the loyalty men had to their families could be manipulated. He saw that honor could be used as an excuse for murder. And he realized that his own detachment, his lack of fierce loyalty to any one clan, was a valuable commodity. Imagine him as a young man, perhaps returning from the fringes of the war. He sees the Hatfield clan rising in power, the McCoy clan nursing their wounds, and a dozen smaller families sharpening their knives over some perceived slight. He watches as men kill each other for the sake of a family name, for a pig, for a dirty look. And in that moment, he doesn't see tragedy or honor. He sees an opportunity. He sees a world where his steady hand and empty conscience could earn him a living. This was the forge that created Talton Hall. The isolation of the mountains taught him self-reliance. The viciousness of the Civil War taught him that life was cheap. And the simmering feuds of the aftermath taught him that there was always someone willing to pay to make someone else's life a little cheaper. He wasn't born a monster. He was hammered into one by the unrelenting violence of his time. Before the name Talton Hall was a curse whispered in the dark, there was simply the man. In the years before his infamy became legend, he was, in his own way, a picture of mountain competence. He was a master of the wilderness, a man who could read the forest like a book and track a deer for days without making a sound. He was a crack shot, his skill with a rifle a thing of local renown. In a land where these abilities meant the difference between a full belly and starvation, or life and death in a confrontation, Talton Hall was exceptionally gifted. He embodied the rugged self-sufficiency that his world demanded. In the periods between the bloody work that would later define him, his life was likely one of stark simplicity. He would have had a cabin tucked away in a hollow so deep and remote that the law was just a rumor. There, he was just another man living off the land, hunting, perhaps tending a small patch of corn for his own use. This was his sanctuary, the place where the ghost could rest. This quiet, solitary existence was the world he sought to protect. It was a world built not on love or community, but on anonymity and isolation, a peace purchased with the proceeds of violence. His relationships, too, were likely forged in the currency of the mountains, fear and pragmatism. He had kin, as all men did, and they would have afforded him the loyalty that blood demanded. But it would have been a loyalty tinged with terror. They may have benefited from his protection, safe in the knowledge that no one would dare cross the family of Talton Hall. But they would have lived under the shadow of his cold nature, always aware of what he was capable of. He wasn't a man who inspired love. He inspired a dreadful, unshakable respect. In his prime, before the New Year's massacre and the murder of Officer Belcher, his reputation was less that of a demon and more that of a tool. A dangerous tool, but a useful one. If a timber company needed a troublesome squatter scared off a piece of land, they might seek out Talt Hall. If a moonshiner needed his still guarded from rivals or federal agents, Hall was the man for the job. He was seen as a regulator, a human weapon to be aimed at a problem. He was the final, violent answer to a dispute that couldn't be settled any other way. In the brutal logic of the mountains, he provided a service. This was the life he built, a quiet existence in the hollows, punctuated by brief, violent forays into the world of men. His stake in the world wasn't a family's love or a community's admiration. It was his freedom. The freedom to move through the mountains unseen, to be a name without a face, and to be the master of his own dark destiny. It was this self-contained, predatory world that was about to be threatened, and its destruction would unleash the full measure of his brutality. Every great tragedy is born from a single, deep-seated flaw. For Talton Hall, it wasn't greed or a quick temper. His flaw was a cold, patient arrogance, a venom that had been brewing for years. He had operated as a shadow for so long, a bringer of death who melted back into the mists, that he had begun to believe he was untouchable. He saw himself as an instrument of a higher, more primal law, and he believed the world of common men, with their sheriffs and their courts, simply did not apply to him. This wasn't just simple pride, it was a core part of his professional identity. It was a shield. The stories they told about him in hushed tones around the fireplace weren't just tales, they were his armor. It was said that Hall could walk into a crowded Pikeville saloon, and the simple act of him ordering a whiskey would be enough to end a loud argument at the other end of the room. He didn't have to raise his voice or draw his gun. He would just fix his piercing eyes on the source of the trouble, and the problem would evaporate. He had come to rely on this aura of fear, to see it as an absolute power. This belief in his own myth was both his greatest strength and his most profound weakness. It gave him the nerve to take on impossible jobs, to face down armed men without flinching. It was the source of the chilling calm he possessed in moments of extreme violence. He wasn't afraid because he genuinely believed he was death itself. And what does death have to fear? But that armor had a crack. Over time, he began to forget the difference between being feared in the secret world of the feuds and being feared in the open world of growing towns. He started to believe his reputation alone would bend reality to his will, no matter where he was or who he was facing. He thought the name Talton Hall was a magic word that made all obstacles disappear. This supreme arrogance, this absolute faith in his own terrifying legend, was making him careless. He began to take risks, to operate more openly, to let the world see the monster it had only whispered about. He was walking a razor's edge, convinced he would never fall, unaware that the world was changing around him. The very flaw that had kept him alive in the lawless wilderness was about to become the engine of his own destruction in a place where a badge and a uniform had started to mean something. For a man who lived in the shadows, Talton Hall had grown dangerously comfortable with the light. In 1891, he crossed the state line into the burgeoning town of Norton, Virginia. He wasn't there on business, not for a contract. He was there for himself, and he was full of whiskey. The quiet, calculating professional had been swallowed by the arrogant legend. He was loud, belligerent, and causing a disturbance, a man who believed his very name was a shield that made him immune to consequence. He was no longer a specter of death. He was a drunken bully, daring the world to challenge him. And the world sent a man named Charles H. Belcher. He wasn't a rival feudist or a hired gun. He was a town policeman, a symbol of everything the mountains were not. He represented order, society, and a law written in books, not in blood. When he saw the disturbance Hall was causing, he did his duty. He walked toward the Pikeville killer, his simple blue uniform a stark contrast to Hall's reputation, which was as dark and formless as a mountain shadow. For Officer Belcher, this was just another drunk to be quieted. He had no idea he was walking toward a man who considered himself a god. The affront, in Hall's mind, was not an insult or a threat. It was the simple act of being confronted. The moment Belcher spoke to him, the moment he attempted to impose the town's law on the mountain's killer, was an intolerable challenge to Hall's entire existence. Eyewitnesses would later describe the look in Hall's eyes, not anger, but a cold, dismissive contempt. Here was a man with a tin badge who thought he could lay hands on Talton Hall. The arrogance that had been simmering for years now boiled over. In Hall's mind, this wasn't a man. It was an obstacle, a thing to be removed. His reaction was not the wild swing of a drunk. It was the chillingly efficient motion of a professional. As Officer Belcher moved to make the arrest, Hall drew his pistol. There was no hesitation, no final warning. The movement was as natural and practiced as breathing. He fired, and Charles Belcher fell to the dusty street. It was not an act of passion or self-defense. It was a correction. It was Talton Hall reminding the world of the natural order of things, where he was the predator and men like Belcher were the prey. But this time was different. In that single deafening moment, Hall's fatal flaw had sealed his fate. He hadn't just killed another man in a long line of men. He had murdered a uniformed officer of the law in public, in the middle of a town that was trying to call itself civilized. He thought he was just swatting away an annoyance, but he had just declared war on the states of Virginia and Kentucky. The gunshot that killed Charles Belcher was an echo that would shake the mountains, and it would hunt Talton Hall to the very end of his days. The murder of a lawman in Norton was a line crossed, a bell that could not be unrung. Talton Hall, a master of the Appalachian wilderness, did what he always did. He vanished. He slipped back across the border into the familiar tangled hollows of Kentucky, believing he could wait out the storm as he had done a dozen times before. This was his first and most arrogant mistake. He thought he had merely killed a man. He failed to understand that he had murdered a symbol, and civilization itself was now coming for him. The response was unlike anything the mountains had ever seen. This wasn't a half-hearted posse led by a local sheriff who was likely related to the man he was hunting. The states of Virginia and Kentucky pooled their resources. Bounties were posted, large enough to make a poor farmer forget all about mountain loyalty. And then came the name that struck a different kind of fear into the hearts of outlaws: the Pinkertons. They were relentless, methodical men who couldn't be bribed, intimidated, or swayed by family ties. They were a modern machine of justice, and they were hunting a relic from a bygone era. Warnings came, not from his enemies, but from what few allies he had left. Old associates, men who understood the shifting tides of power, would have told him in no uncertain terms, "Talt, this is different," they'd say. "You killed a badge in the street. They ain't gonna stop. You need to go west, disappear for good." They offered him the only path that might lead to survival, true, absolute anonymity, far from the mountains that knew his name. But Talton Hall's arrogance was a wall that no reason could penetrate. He scoffed at the warnings. He had outsmarted the law his entire life. He saw the Pinkertons as nothing more than city boys who would get lost in the first creek bed. In his mind, this massive manhunt was almost a testament to his own legend. It was a grand, fitting challenge for the Pikeville killer. He believed he was smarter, tougher, and more cunning than any man they could send after him. He saw every posted bounty with his name on it, not as a threat, but as an acknowledgement of his status. With each passing week, however, his world shrank. The net tightened. A cabin door that would have once swung open for him now remained bolted shut. A meal that would have been freely given was now denied. The fear of the law had finally begun to outweigh the fear of Talton Hall. He was becoming a ghost in his own homeland, a toxic presence that even his own kin could no longer afford to shelter. Each closed door was another offer of help rejected, another chance to escape squandered because his pride would not let him see the truth. He was being squeezed out of the only environment where he knew how to survive. The decision to finally flee, to make a run for a place like Memphis, Tennessee, was not a strategic retreat. It was an act of desperation. He was leaving the tangled wilderness that was his shield and armor and heading for the open, anonymous streets of a city. He was a mountain predator who had been driven from his forest, forced to walk onto the open plains where the hunters could see him for miles. His path of no compromise had led him right into a trap of his own making. Memphis was a cage of brick and smoke, a foreign land to a man born of mist and shadow. Talton Hall was cornered. He could feel it in the way people looked at him on the street, in the tightening knot in his own gut. The relentless machinery of the law, guided by the cold intelligence of the Pinkertons, had found him. He was no longer the apex predator of the Kentucky Hollows. He was a wolf tracked to a city alley, with the hounds closing in. He was in a cheap boarding house, listening to the city breathe, knowing that each breath might be his last moment of freedom. And then he heard it. The heavy, deliberate footsteps on the boarding house stairs. This was it. This was the moment that had been coming for him since the day he pulled the trigger on Officer Belcher. In that quiet, terrifying space between one footstep and the next, he stood at his final crossroads. He had one last choice to make. He could wait, hands empty, and surrender. He could give himself up to the justice he had so long despised, face a trial, a judge, a jury. It would mean a cage, a public shaming, but it would also mean life. It was the off-ramp, the final chance to let this story end, not with a bang, but with the quiet closing of a cell door. For a split second, a different path might have appeared in his mind's eye. A long, drawn-out trial, a life spent in a stone penitentiary. Could Talton Hall, the mountain demon, truly allow himself to be led in chains, to be put on display like a captured animal? Could the man, whose reputation was a weapon in itself, allow that reputation to be stripped away, leaving only a common, pathetic killer? The very idea was a kind of death more profound than any bullet. It was an assault on the only thing he had ever truly built, his own terrifying myth. The answer, when it came, was as swift and final as one of his own gunshots. No. The thought was more repulsive than a hangman's noose. His arrogance, the fatal flaw that had brought him to this very room, made its final stand. He would not be broken. He would not be humiliated. The law could have his body, but it would not have his submission. He made a conscious, chilling choice. He rejected the chance for a quiet end and fully embraced the violent destiny he had been carving for himself his entire life. He didn't make a run for the window or try to barricade the door. That was the act of a desperate man hoping to live. Instead, he calmly walked to his bag, pulled out his revolver, and checked the loads. Each click of the cylinder was a word in his final sentence. In that moment, he sealed his own fate, not with resignation, but with defiance. He chose to be the Pikeville killer right to the very end. The lawmen breaking down his door wouldn't be capturing a fugitive. They would be walking into the last act of a legend, an act that Tulton Hall himself had decided to write in blood. The splintering of the door was the only warning he needed. It wasn't the sound of a lock being picked or a hinge being forced. It was the raw, violent crack of wood giving way to brute force. For Tulton Hall, the world, which had been a tightening cage of streets and unfamiliar faces, suddenly shrank to the size of that small boarding house room. He was a creature of the deep woods, and in that moment, the lawmen crashing through the door were no different from a pack of hounds cornering a wolf in a box canyon. He wasn't panicked. He was eerily calm, the way a man is when he finally meets a fate he has been expecting his whole life. All the running, all the hiding, it had all led to this cramped, smoke-stained room. The revolver felt cool and familiar in his hand, a solid piece of certainty in a world that was coming apart. The figures in the doorway were just shapes, dark silhouettes against the light of the hallway, and in his mind, they ceased to be men. They were simply the final problem he had to solve. His hand moved with a fluid economy that was born of 1,000 deadly calculations. The room erupted in a deafening concussion of sound and fire. The muzzle flash was a bolt of lightning in the dimness, momentarily illuminating the determined faces in the doorway. It was the only language he knew how to speak to a world that sought to contain him, a single, explosive syllable of pure defiance. The smell of burnt gunpowder filled his nostrils, a scent more familiar to him than any perfume. But this was not a mountain holler where a single shot could settle an argument for good. Thunder answered thunder from the doorway. More flashes of light strobed across the room, turning the air into a chaotic storm of noise and swirling, acrid smoke. The world narrowed to the kick of the revolver in his hand, the ringing in his ears that drowned out all other sounds, and the shadowy dance of figures in the smoke. For a few heartbeats, Tulton Hall was in his element, a whirlwind of violence at the heart of the storm. Then, a sensation he hadn't felt in years, a sharp, searing impact in his arm, a force that felt like a blacksmith's hammer. His fingers went numb. His trusted revolver, the instrument of his will, suddenly felt like a useless lump of lead. The weapon clattered to the wooden floor, the sound small and insignificant after the deafening roar of the gunfight. The storm inside the room had passed as quickly as it had begun. An almost supernatural silence descended, broken only by the harsh sound of men breathing and the slow, acrid clearing of the gun smoke. The dark silhouettes in the doorway resolved into tired, grim-faced lawmen, their own pistols still smoking. They moved in, not with anger, but with a weary professionalism. The fight was over. The great Tulton Hall, the Pikeville killer, was standing in a ruined room, his arm useless, his gun on the floor. The final act was not a shout, but a cold, metallic whisper. The chilling slide and click of handcuffs locking around his wrists. That sound, more than any bullet, was the one that ended his life. In that moment, the legend died, and all that was left was a captured man facing the cold, methodical justice he had so long outrun. The roaring storm of his life had ended in the quiet snap of a lock. There was no triumph in the eyes of the lawmen who took him, only a grim, professional exhaustion. For Tulton Hall, the moments after his capture were a blur of pain from his wounded arm and the heavier, colder pain of the shackles on his wrists. The swagger of the untouchable killer was finally gone, replaced by the quiet, heavy stillness of a caged animal. He wasn't filled with regret or fear, but with a deep, sullen emptiness. The world had finally proven to be bigger and stronger than his own myth, and the realization settled on him like a shroud. His journey back to the mountains was not a victory parade for the law. It was a covert operation, thick with tension. They knew the name Talton Hall still held power, that his allies might try to free him, or worse, that the families of his victims might try to kill him before he ever saw a courtroom. So they put him on a train, but its route was a lie, a winding, circuitous path designed to throw off any potential ambushes. He was heavily guarded, a man so dangerous that even in chains, he was treated like a ticking bomb. For Hall, the journey was a special kind of hell. He sat in the rattling train car, watching the familiar landscape of his homeland slide by through the grimy window. He saw the misty blue ridges, the deep, dark hollows, the very terrain that had once been his fortress and his kingdom. Now, it was just scenery on his final ride. Each mile that clicked by on the tracks was a mile closer to his end. He was a king being paraded through his conquered territory, a ghost forced to revisit his old haunting grounds one last time, not as a predator, but as prey. He was silent the whole way, a brooding, dark presence that unnerved even his seasoned guards. The fight had gone out of him, but the malice had not. He was no longer an active player in his own story. He was cargo. His fate was now in the hands of other men, and his only remaining role was to arrive at his destination. The end of the road for Talton Hall wasn't going to be a courtroom or a jail cell. It was this train, this slow, rattling journey back into the heart of the mountains that were waiting to claim him, one way or another. The news of Talton Hall's capture didn't travel by wire or by rail. It moved like smoke on the wind, from one isolated cabin to the next, carried by riders on horseback and whispered across fence lines. And with that news, the fragile, fearful peace of the mountains was shattered. The fall of one man sent a shockwave that would ripple through every holler, leaving a trail of wreckage that had little to do with Hall himself. His personal story was ending, but the tragedy he had authored was just entering its most brutal chapter. For his own kin, the name Hall, once a shield of fear, now became a target. The protection his terrifying reputation had afforded them vanished overnight. Now, they were just the family of a captured killer, vulnerable and exposed. Every shadow on the road, every late-night bark of a dog would send a spike of fear through them. They were living in the crosshairs of every man who had ever held a grudge against Talton, and that was a very long list. The sins of the father were about to be visited upon them, and their lives would become a paranoid existence of bolted doors and watchful eyes. For the families of his victims, the news was not a relief. It was a call to arms. For the widow of Charles Belcher, it was the reawakening of a grief that was still raw. For the remaining McCoys, who had seen their brothers tied to pawpaw trees and their sister shot down in the snow, this was not a matter for a distant court. It was a personal debt of blood that had come due. Hall's capture didn't bring closure. It tore the scabs off wounds that had never healed, and the pain demanded a release. Their desire was not for legal proceedings, it was for a reckoning. The entire community felt the tremor. For years, the violence had been, if not controlled, then at least predictable. It followed the dark logic of the feuds. But Hall's capture created a power vacuum, a chaotic moment where old hatreds could flare without a central figure to fear. He had acted as a cancer on the region, and his removal didn't cure the disease. It simply sent the body into a violent, final spasm. The quiet resentment of his reign of terror now had a voice, and it was a chorus calling for vengeance. The true wreckage Talton Hall left behind was not the bodies he had buried, but the hatred he had cultivated. He had spent his life profiting from the region's culture of violence, and now, even in chains, he was about to give it one last, terrible gift. His capture hadn't brought peace. It had simply brought the promise of a different, more terrible kind of violence, a communal violence, where an entire region, haunted by his ghost, would gather to deliver a final bloody verdict of its own. The law had done its part. It had hunted a killer across state lines, engaged him in a gunfight, and brought him back in chains. The next step in the machinery of civilization was a trial, a slow, methodical process of evidence, testimony, and deliberation. The Commonwealth of Kentucky intended to give Talton Hall a proper legal defense, a jury of his peers, and a verdict rendered under the solemn roof of a courthouse. It was a testament to the new order that was trying to tame the mountains, an insistence that the rule of law was absolute and applied to all men, even the devil of the Tug Fork. But in the mountains, another court was already in session. This court didn't meet in a building. It gathered in secret, in barns and on ridges, under the cold light of the moon. Its jurors were men with names like McCoy and Belcher. Its evidence was not written on paper, but scarred into their memories. The image of a burning cabin, of brothers tied to trees, of a good man bleeding out in a dusty street. The code they operated under was ancient, simple, and merciless. It was the mountain code of an eye for an eye, a blood debt that could only be paid in one currency. The clash between these two systems of justice was inevitable. As the train carrying Talton Hall chugged closer to Pikeville, the official legal process became more and more irrelevant. The law saw a prisoner who needed to be tried. The community saw a rabid dog that needed to be put down. The lawmen guarding Hall were operating under their code of duty and due process. The mob gathering to meet the train was operating under a code of honor and vengeance that was etched into the very stones of the mountains. The community's verdict had been reached long before Hall was ever captured. He was guilty, not just of killing Officer Belcher, but of everything. He was the living embodiment of the fear and violence that had plagued their lives for a generation. A trial, in their eyes, was a farce. It was a place where legal tricks and silver-tongued lawyers might let a monster walk free. They had seen it happen before. They had no faith in a system that seemed so far removed from the raw, immediate reality of their lives. They believed in a more direct, more certain form of justice. The train carrying Talton Hall was the ultimate symbol of this clash. Inside the car was the prisoner of the state, a component in a legal machine. But outside, gathering in the darkness, was the judgment of the mountains. The law's plan was to deliver him to a jail. The mountain's plan was to deliver him to a tree. In the end, it was a question of whose jurisdiction was more powerful in that place, on that night. Was it the new, fragile authority of the state, or the old, unyielding power of the clan? The answer was coming as surely as the train was coming down the tracks. While Talton Hall was taking his last ragged breaths in a Virginia town square, another man, a far more powerful one, was watching the world change from his porch in West Virginia. What became of Anderson Devil Anse Hatfield, the patriarch who had employed Hall's gun and allegedly directed the New Year's night massacre? Did he face a mob's justice? Did he ever see the inside of a courtroom for the crimes of the feud? The answer adds a bitter, complex layer to this story of mountain justice. The brutal attack on the McCoy cabin was a turning point. It was too savage, even for the feuding mountains, and it brought the full weight of the law down on the Hatfield clan. Several of Devil Anse's sons and supporters were hunted down, tried, and sent to prison. One, Ellison Cottontop Mounts, was hanged for his role in the massacre. The political power that Devil Anse had wielded for decades began to crumble. The war was over, and in a way, he had lost. But Devil Anse himself, the great leader of the clan, was never made to pay by the law. He was indicted, but he was never arrested, never forced to stand trial for the murders of the McCoy children. He lived out the rest of his days as a timberman and a farmer, a living legend who had outlasted his own violent era. In a final strange twist, the man they called Devil Ants was baptized in his old age, seeking peace with his God after a life of war with his neighbors. He died of pneumonia in 1921 and was buried on a mountainside overlooking the land he had fought so fiercely to control. This is the messy, unsatisfying truth of it all. Talton Hall, the hired gun, the disposable instrument of violence, was lynched by a mob for a crime committed in the open. His death was brutal, public, and absolute. But the powerful man who had allegedly paid for his services, who had directed the feud from the top, died a free man in his own bed. The mob got its vengeance, but it got it from the hired help, not the man who wrote the checks. The story of Talton Hall's end is not just about justice being served, it's about who it's served to and who gets to walk away. After the mob dispersed and Talton Hall's body was cut down, a strange and heavy quiet fell over Wise, Virginia, and the surrounding mountains. The great bloody chapter was over, but the book was not yet closed. The years that followed were not years of celebration or relief. They were years of silence. The community had performed a brutal act of surgery on itself, cutting out a cancer. But the wound was deep, jagged, and slow to heal. For the descendants of Talton Hall, the name became a curse and a burden. They scattered, some moving deeper into the anonymous folds of the mountains, others leaving the region entirely, hoping to outrun the ghost of their infamous kinsman. They became quiet farmers, miners, and laborers, their primary goal to be unremarkable, to be forgotten. To admit you were kin to Talton Hall was to invite suspicion and open old wounds. They buried the name under a blanket of deliberate obscurity, hoping that with enough time, the blood on it would fade. The community, too, sought healing through a kind of collective amnesia. The men who had been part of the lynch mob went back to their fields and their families. They had to live and trade with their neighbors, some of whom might have been Hall's distant kin. To speak of that night, to name the names of the men who held the rope, would have been to invite a new generation of bloodshed. And so, they simply stopped talking about it. The lynching of Talton Hall became a story told only to outsiders or to children as a cautionary tale. Within the community itself, it was a scar that everyone could see, but no one dared to touch. But the power dynamics of the region had been irrevocably altered. Hall's death was a brutal exclamation point at the end of an era. It was a clear and bloody message that the days of the untouchable gunfighter, the man who could be hired to settle a family squabble with a rifle, were over. The power of the old clan patriarchs like Devil Ants was waning, replaced by the growing influence of coal company bosses and county sheriffs. The law, which had failed to bring Hall to a trial, had still won in the end. The community's own violent act of justice had, ironically, reinforced the idea that the old way of the feud was a path to ruin for everyone involved. The era of private wars was dying, and the era of state-sponsored law, however flawed, was being born. The man named Talton Hall was gone, but the ghost of his name lingered. For decades, the most powerful physical remnant of his story was not a grave, but a tree. The big maple in the courthouse square in Wise, Virginia, became a dark landmark. People would point it out to their children, their voices dropping to a whisper. "That's the tree," they'd say. "That's where they hung the Pikeville killer." Its branches, which had once offered shade, now seemed to cast a permanent, chilling shadow. It was a living monument to a night of mob justice, its roots rumored to have drunk deep from the blood-soaked ground. Eventually, as the town grew and tried to bury its violent past, the tree was cut down, its wood hauled away, as if removing the object could erase the memory. His other physical traces were quietly erased. There is no grand tombstone bearing his name. He was likely buried in an unmarked potter's field, a final anonymous end for a man whose name once commanded such terror. The cabins he lived in have long since rotted back into the damp earth of the hollows, leaving no trace. It's a strange and fitting irony. The man who worked so hard to be a faceless shadow in life was rendered completely faceless in death. All of his physical reality was scrubbed from the world. But you can't kill a good story, and the tale of Talton Hall was too dark and powerful to die. It transformed. It left the realm of history and entered the world of folklore. For generations, people in Wise claimed that on still, moonlit nights, if you looked at the spot where the old maple stood, you could still see him. A spectral figure, dangling silently in the air, a permanent, ghostly reminder of the night the law of the mountains was served. The man became a boogeyman, a cautionary tale told to frighten unruly children into behaving. His life became a kind of unwritten murder ballad, the verses known by heart in every holler. He was no longer just a man, he was a character, a symbol of the entire bloody era of the feuds. His name became a shorthand for a certain kind of cold, professional violence. When old-timers spoke of the bad days, of the lawless times before the coal companies and the state police truly took hold, the name they would use to punctuate their point was always the same. It was a time of men like Talton Hall. So while the man himself is dust, and the tree that ended his life is gone, his spirit, the spirit of the mountain gunfighter, still haunts the collective memory of Appalachia. He is the ghost that walks the ridgelines of the past, a chilling echo of a time when justice didn't come from a book, but from the barrel of a gun and the end of a rope. So we come back to the question that hung in the air at the very beginning, a question as quiet and heavy as the mountain fog. Was Talton Hall a hero or a villain? The answer is as clear and cold as a Kentucky creek in winter. He was no hero. He was a killer, a man who dealt in death for profit, whose hands were stained with the blood of an unknown number of men. There is no honor in that. But to simply call him a villain is to miss the deeper, more unsettling truth of his story. Talton Hall was not an aberration. He was a perfect, terrible product of his time and place. He was a monster, but a monster the mountains themselves had birthed. He was forged in the pointless brutality of the Civil War and sharpened on the whetstone of the feuds. He was the logical conclusion of a world where law was a suggestion and violence was a way of life. He was a symptom of a disease, not the disease itself. In the end, this is a story about a man whose greatest strength, his absolute belief in his own terrifying legend, became the flaw that destroyed him. He saw himself as a timeless force, a permanent part of the mountain landscape. But the world was changing around him. The law, clumsy and slow as it was coming. He was a relic of a savage past, unable and unwilling to adapt. The same cold arrogance that made him a feared gunfighter made him blind to the fact that his time was over. And that, my friends, is the ballad of Talton Hall. A killer who sold his gun to the highest bidder and whose life was finally paid for, not with silver dollars, but with a rope, in a town square that wanted to forget his name. Imagine this. An old woman sits on her porch in the misty mountains, her voice thin but clear. The tune she sings is simple, almost a lullaby. But the words tell of a jealous lover, a flash of steel, and a shallow grave by the river. This isn't just a song, it's a coroner's report. It's a witness statement from a ghost. Now imagine realizing that the hills around you are filled with these musical affidavits, detailing every kind of human tragedy imaginable. What if the darkest secrets of a region weren't written in dusty court records, but were hidden in plain sight, carried on a mournful melody? And who was the strange, suit-wearing lawyer who dared to venture into those isolated hollows to collect them? Today, we follow the man who became a detective of the past, using a banjo instead of a magnifying glass to uncover the bloody sagas the mountains tried to forget. Before we follow the man in the suit, we must first understand the world he was trying to save. In the early 1900s, the Appalachian Mountains were a nation unto themselves, a place where time flowed like creek water, slowly and in its own channel. The true victims of this story weren't just the people in the ballads, it was the memory of them, a living history held together by the frailest of threads, the human voice. This was a world built on self-reliance, where your closest neighbor might be a 2-hour walk over a ridge, and the law was often a distant, abstract idea. The keepers of these stories were not scholars or poets. They were farmers whose hands were stained with the same soil that would one day cover them. They were mothers who sang murder ballads to their children like lullabies, not to frighten them, but to teach them about the very real dangers of the world. Their lives were a cycle of hardship and small joys, marked by the seasons, the birth of a child, or the death of a neighbor. Their dreams were not of fame or fortune, but of a good harvest, healthy livestock, and a winter with enough firewood to keep the cold at bay. The mountains themselves were a living character in every story. They were a fortress that protected this unique culture, but also a prison that bred isolation and suspicion. A foggy hollow could hide a moonshine still, a family feud, or a fresh grave with equal ease. The deep woods and winding trails that were a source of life and sustenance could also swallow a person whole, leaving behind nothing but a whispered story. Justice here was often personal, and consequences were swift and final. These ballads, then, were more than just entertainment for long winter nights. They were the community's collective memory, its legal code, and its moral compass. A song about a betrayed lover was a stark warning. A ballad recounting a feud served as a map of bad blood, reminding each new generation who their friends were and who they could never trust. To lose these songs would be like a town losing its courthouse records, its newspaper archives, and its gravestones all at once. But even in this isolated world, shadows were beginning to gather. The first crackle of the radio was starting to echo through the hollows, bringing with it new songs from faraway cities. Young folks were hearing tales of a different life, a world of electricity and automobiles, and some were beginning to see the old ways as a burden. An entire library of ghosts, a complete history of human passion, violence, and sorrow, was at risk of fading into an unspoken silence, and only a very few seemed to notice. When Bascom Lamar Lunsford arrived in a remote holler, he was stepping into a unique kind of crime scene, one where the evidence was not bloodstains or broken furniture, but fading memories and fractured melodies. The first sign that something was wrong was often the silence. He would visit a family known for its music, only to find the younger generation knew the latest radio hit, but not the half-forgotten ballad their own grandfather used to sing about a local tragedy. The air was thick with an unnatural quiet, the sound of a culture slowly losing its voice. The clues he found were scattered and cryptic. In one cabin, he might collect a single haunting verse of the Omi Wise saga, a piece of the story preserved like a shard of bone. Miles away, over another ridge, he might hear the same melody, but attached to a different set of words, the names changed to protect a long-dead ancestor. He would find specific, tangible details embedded in the lyrics, the mention of the Yadkin River, or a landmark like Adams Falls, clues that felt as real and specific as a footprint left at the scene of a crime. These weren't just random stories, they were anchored to the very soil beneath his feet. Yet this evidence only deepened the mystery. The scene spoke of chaos and the ravages of time. For every fact a song seemed to preserve, it offered 10 contradictions. Was Tom Dula a heartless killer, or a handsome fool manipulated by a jealous woman? The ballads Lunsford collected painted him as both, sometimes in the very same version. The trail of truth was overgrown with decades of gossip, family pride, and the simple, inevitable erosion of memory. The mountains held the secrets, but they offered no easy answers. Lunsford quickly realized his task was far more complex than simple recording. He was an archaeologist of sorrow, trying to reconstruct a complete skeleton from a handful of scattered, mismatched bones. Every person he spoke to was a witness, but their testimony was shaped by who told them the story and why. The wilderness he was navigating wasn't just the dense laurel thickets and steep ravines of the Blue Ridge, but the tangled, treacherous landscape of human memory itself, and it was filled with a multitude of unsettling questions. The first and most powerful suspect in the slow murder of these mountain sagas was the community itself. Lunsford quickly discovered that the greatest threat to a story was often the pain it carried. These weren't tales of distant kings and queens, they were raw, open wounds in the local memory. To sing about a young woman drowned in a river was to remember the real girl whose family still lived just down the creek. The songs were a constant reminder of a neighbor's betrayal, an ancestor's shame, or a violence that had torn families apart. Forgetting was not an accident. It was a choice, a form of self-preservation. The motive was a deep and understandable desire to bury the past. Many families felt a personal vendetta against the very history that defined them. As the 20th century progressed, the outside world began to cast a long shadow, bringing with it a condescending judgment of Appalachian life. The stereotype of the violent, feuding hillbilly was taking root, and these murder ballads felt like Exhibit A. To the younger generation especially, these songs were not a proud heritage, but a source of shame, a link to a brutal past they were desperate to escape. They wanted radios and cars, not grim reminders of the bad old days. The evidence of this quiet conspiracy was everywhere Lunsford looked. He'd approach an old man known to be a master fiddler and ask about a specific feud ballad, only to be met with a stony silence and the curt reply, "We don't trouble with that one no more." Parents actively stopped teaching the darkest songs to their children, preferring to pass on church hymns or the cheerful, impersonal tunes coming over the airwaves. This wasn't just forgetfulness, it was a deliberate act of cultural pruning, cutting away the painful branches of their own family trees. The community was turning on its own memories, hoping that silence would finally bring peace to the ghosts that haunted their hollows. If shame was driving the old songs into the shadows, a more seductive threat was beginning to change them in the open. The second suspect was someone no one wanted to point a finger at, the most gifted and ambitious musicians themselves. These were the keepers of the flame, the high priests of the tradition, the very people Lunsford sought out as his most valuable sources. Their betrayal wasn't one of malice, but of temptation, a quiet corruption that came from within the circle of trust. The secret motive was the dazzling promise of the modern world, delivered on a spinning shellac disc. In the 1920s, talent scouts from record labels like Victor and OK began venturing into the mountains. They weren't looking for historical documents, they were hunting for hits. They offered cash money, a life-changing sum for a family living on the edge of poverty, for a 3-minute recording. Suddenly, a song wasn't just a piece of heritage. It was a potential ticket to a life beyond the cornfield and the coal mine. A musician who had only ever played for neighbors at a barn dance was now being offered a small taste of immortality. Lunsford began to see the evidence of this pact everywhere. A long, grim ballad he had collected in its pure form from an elderly woman would reappear on a commercial record, but it would be different. The 15-verse saga of a bloody feud, with all its specific names and local details, was trimmed to a tidy 3 minutes. The killer's chilling, remorseless confession was replaced with a more palatable, moralizing chorus. The very soul of the story, its raw, uncomfortable truth, was being sanitized for sale. The custodians of the culture, in their understandable desire for a better life, were becoming agents of its alteration, polishing the jagged edges off the evidence until it no longer told the whole story. But the most dangerous intruder didn't carry a gun or a land deed. It arrived in a polished wooden box and spoke with 1,000 voices from a world away. The third suspect was a vast, impersonal, and relentless force, the rise of national mass media spearheaded by the radio. This was an entity with no face and no name, an invisible invader that could slip through the cracks of the tightest-knit community and whisper its promises directly into the heart of the home. Its motive was not malicious. It was something far more powerful: commerce. The radio wasn't interested in preserving the grim history of a specific mountain county. Its purpose was to create a single, unified American culture, one that bought the same soap, drove the same cars, and listened to the same songs. The old ballads, with their dark themes, rough edges, and hyper-local references, were an obstacle to this new, streamlined world. They were static in the signal of progress, a relic that didn't fit into a tidy, half-hour sponsored program. The presence of this threat created a quiet, creeping sense of cultural anxiety. The ancient art of storytelling, of passing a song from one generation to the next on a cold winter's night, was suddenly in competition with professional comedians and crooners from Nashville and New York. The local fiddler, a hero in his community for decades, now sounded amateurish compared to the polished bands broadcasting from the Grand Ole Opry. This external force didn't need to threaten or intimidate. Its very existence was a judgment. It carried an air of quiet menace, not with violence, but with the subtle, corrosive suggestion that the old ways were no longer good enough. In the beginning, Bascom Lamar Lunsford approached his collection like the lawyer he was, with a methodical belief that for every crime there was a single, definitive truth. He ventured into the mountains not just as a collector, but as an investigator, certain that he could track down the one pure version of each ballad, the original testimony that had been passed down unaltered through the generations. He believed that somewhere, in the most remote cabin, held in the memory of the oldest living soul, was the definitive, uncorrupted story of what truly happened to Laura Foster. He pursued this phantom through the rugged wilderness of human memory. He would meticulously record what he believed was the final word on the Tom Dula saga from a farmer in Wilkes County, only to travel 20 miles over the next ridge and hear a contradictory version from the man's own cousin. One song painted Tom as a romantic fool, another as a heartless killer. Ann Melton was a jealous accomplice in one holler and an innocent victim of rumor in the next. Every promising lead, every witness who claimed to have the real story from their great-grandmother, only led to another dead end, another fork in the trail. The single solid truth he sought was a red herring. He also assumed that the most celebrated local musicians, the prize-winning fiddlers and banjo pickers, would be the most reliable keepers of the ancient songs. He followed the sound of their music to barn dances and town squares, hoping to find the mother lode. But this trail, too, quickly went cold. He discovered that these were often the very people who had already been compromised. They were the first to be tempted by the record companies, the quickest to alter a 15-verse ballad into a catchy 3-minute tune. Their brilliant playing was often a cover for a story that had been stripped of its soul. The frustration for Lunsford must have been immense. The logical, orderly processes that worked in a courtroom were useless here. The evidence was alive, constantly changing with every telling. His investigation was yielding not clarity, but a growing, maddening fog. In the communities, his relentless, probing questions began to stir a quiet unease. The fear was growing that perhaps these stories were not meant to be solved. Perhaps in trying to untangle the truth, this man from the outside world was simply pulling apart the last fragile threads holding their entire history together. As Bascom Lamar Lunsford pushed deeper into the mountains, the friendly smiles and offered dippers of water remained, but a new barrier rose to meet him, one as real as a stone wall, yet completely invisible. He was running into the unspoken law of the hills, a code of silence as old as the feuds themselves. The moment he moved beyond pleasantries and asked for a specific bloody ballad by name, the air on the porch would grow still. Eyes would drop. The answer was almost always the same: a slow shake of the head and a quiet mumble of "don't rightly recall that one," or the even more final, "we let that story die with the old folks." The reasons for this omerta were buried deep in the soil of the community. These songs were not abstract folklore, they were active social documents. To sing the ballad of the Allen-Griffin feud in front of an Allen was more than rude. It was a hostile act, a dredging up of bad blood that generations had worked to bury. The names in the verses were not characters in a fable. They were the names on the weathered tombstones in the churchyard just up the hill. Lunsford quickly learned he wasn't just asking for a song. He was asking a man to testify against his neighbor's great-grandfather, and that was a line no one was willing to cross for a stranger. There was also a deep and abiding suspicion of any outsider asking too many questions. Who was this man in a starched collar, writing down their tragedies in his little notebook? The mountains had a long memory of being exploited by timber companies, by coal barons, and by condescending writers who came to caricature their way of life. Was Lunsford any different? Was he a cultural undertaker, come to put their most painful memories on display for a gawking world that already saw them as little more than violent savages? The silence was a shield, a way of protecting what little they had left that was truly their own. The psychological toll on the few who considered breaking this code was immense. One old woman, who knew a version of a local murder ballad that Lunsford had been searching for years, would only agree to sing it for him in her spring house, with the door bolted and the sound of the running water masking her voice. She was terrified, not of physical harm, but of something worse. The judgment of her neighbors, the quiet shunning that would follow if they knew she had given away their ghosts. In these hills, a reputation was all a person had, and the price for breaking the wall of silence was to lose it forever. For months, perhaps years, Bascom Lamar Lunsford operated as a detective chasing a ghost. He was searching for a single, verifiable truth, a definitive version of each ballad that could be entered into the record as historical fact. But the mountains resisted. The contradictions piled up, the silence grew deeper, and the logical mind of the lawyer was nearing a point of despair. He had a collection of beautiful broken fragments, but the complete, unassailable story he sought remained as elusive as smoke. The trail, it seemed, had finally gone cold. The turning point came not with a dramatic deathbed confession, but in a moment of quiet frustration. He was sitting on a porch with an elderly woman, trying once again to coax from her the full version of a local feud ballad. She would sing the beginning, her voice strong and sure, but when it came to the verses describing the killing, she would stop, shake her head, and hum a different tune, a simple, mournful church hymn. Lunsford, seeing another day's work dissolving into another dead end, was about to pack his things. But then he stopped, and he listened. He truly listened, not to the words, but to the feeling behind them. In the sorrowful cadence of that hymn, he suddenly heard the echo of the murder ballad. The forgotten clue wasn't a hidden lyric or a secret name. It was the realization that the emotion was the one thing that had survived intact. The community might change the names, forget the details, or refuse to speak the violence, but they never forgot the grief. The hymn was their way of telling the story when the story itself became too terrible to tell. It was the emotional core, the untainted piece of evidence he had been overlooking this whole time. This moment changed everything. It was as if a key had turned in a lock he didn't even know was there. He realized his entire approach had been wrong. He was not a detective hunting for a single culprit or a single truth. He was an archivist of human heartbreak. The contradictions and variations weren't flaws in the evidence. They were the evidence. They showed how a community grappled with, processed, and tried to heal from a trauma over generations. A renewed urgency surged through him. He had to collect it all, every fractured verse, every sanitized radio version, every mournful hymn that carried the ghost of the original tragedy. The real story wasn't in any single song, it was in the sum of all of them. With this new understanding, Bascom Lamar Lunsford stood like a prosecutor ready to deliver his closing argument. But in the spectral courtroom of his mind, the witness stand was empty, and the jury box was filled with ghosts. He had spent years searching for a single villain responsible for the slow death of the mountain sagas. He had cross-examined shame, ambition, and the relentless march of progress. And now, as he pieced together the fragments of evidence, the half-remembered verses, the sanitized records, the telling silences, the horrifying truth finally took shape. There was no single culprit. It was a conspiracy. He finally saw the first conspirator for what it was, the community's own shame. This was the inside man, the accomplice who unlocked the door and let the other forces in. The raw, bloody memories of the ballads had become a burden, a mark of otherness in a world that was rapidly modernizing. By choosing to bury their most painful stories, by refusing to teach their children the songs of feud and betrayal, the mountain folk had, with the best intentions, created a vacuum. They had disarmed their own culture, leaving it vulnerable and defenseless against the coming storm. Into this vacuum stepped the second conspirator, the gifted local musician, tempted by the promise of a world beyond the mountains. These were not villains, but tragic figures caught between two worlds. Driven by the understandable human desire for a few dollars and a little recognition, they became the unwitting agents of the crime. They took the raw, unvarnished testimony of the old songs and polished it for public consumption. They cut out the darkest verses, smoothed over the rough language, and sold a palatable, commercialized ghost of the real thing. They were the ones who put the forged signature on a false confession. And finally, Lunsford saw the mastermind, the cold, impersonal force that had orchestrated the entire affair, the radio and the rise of a national commercial culture. This was the entity that provided the motive, the means, and the opportunity. It offered a shiny, new, and effortless form of entertainment that made the old ways seem obsolete. It whispered the promise of a unified America where everyone listened to the same songs and shared the same simple stories. It created the very shame that had weakened the community's resolve and offered the very temptation that had turned its own guardians against it. In the end, Lunsford's discovery was far more chilling than a single, identifiable villain. The true culprit was an unholy trinity, a perfect and terrible collaboration between the past, the present, and the future. The motive wasn't malice, but something far more powerful, the inevitable crushing weight of change. The ancient, isolated world of the mountains, with its dark memories and bloody sagas, had been put on trial by the 20th century. And in this trial, there could only be one verdict. The old world was found guilty of being old, and the sentence was death by forgetting. Now that we have identified the culprits, we can finally reconstruct the crime. This was not a murder committed in a dark alley with a single sudden blow. It was a slow poisoning carried out in the warm, fire-lit cabins of the mountains themselves, with the victims' own families as unknowing accomplices. The truth, my friends, is that the ballads were not killed. They were allowed to die. Imagine an old man, a patriarch, sitting on his porch with his grandson as the evening shadows stretch across the hollow. He clears his throat to sing the old ballad, the one about the land dispute that cost his own great-uncle his life. He begins the first verse, his voice a familiar, comforting rasp. But then he looks at the boy, who is wearing a store-bought shirt and whose mind is full of things like automobiles and the world beyond the ridge. And the old man's voice falters. The next words, the ones about the gunshot and the bitter feud, freeze in his throat. In that moment of silence, a story that had survived for a century suffers a mortal wound. It doesn't end with a scream, but with a quiet, heartbreaking stillness. Now picture a different scene, a few years later. A talented young fiddler, the pride of his county, sits stiffly in front of a strange, cone-shaped microphone in a makeshift studio in a Bristol hotel room. A man in a suit tells him he has 3 minutes. He begins to sing the saga of Omi Wise, but when he gets to the part where the villain pleads with her, he softens the words. He changes a raw, brutal line into a more poetic, romantic one. The man in the suit nods in approval. And with that single, simple change, the soul of the song begins to bleed out, replaced by something cleaner, safer, and no longer entirely true. The final blow came not from a person, but from a piece of furniture. See it in your mind's eye. A family gathered in their cabin after supper. For generations, this was the time for stories, for the banjo to be taken down from its peg. But now, in the corner, sits a handsome wooden box with a glowing dial, a single cyclops eye staring into the room. They turn a knob, and a clear voice from Nashville fills the cabin with a song about a love they've never known and a city they've never seen. They are captivated. And over in the shadows, the banjo hangs on the wall, untouched. Its strings are not broken, they are simply silent. This is how the great bloody sagas of the mountains met their end. There was no single gunshot, no grand battle. It was 1,000 tiny, quiet surrenders. A forgotten verse here, a changed lyric there, an evening spent listening to the radio instead of a grandfather's voice. The stories became ghosts in their own homes, fading slowly until only a faint, melodic echo remained. They weren't murdered in a fit of passion. They were simply starved, one by one, in the quiet, comfortable darkness of a new and brighter world. There was no grand courtroom for this crime, no judge in black robes. The trial of the mountain ballads was held in the court of progress, and the jury was the American people, whose ears were already filled with the siren song of a new century. The prosecution, a slick and powerful attorney called the Future, presented its case with devastating force. It showed evidence of a faster, brighter, more connected world, a world of convenience and prosperity that made the old ways seem slow, dark, and obsolete. The defense was barely heard, a few faint, mournful notes from an old fiddle, drowned out by the confident roar of the radio. The accused parties reacted to the proceedings in their own ways. The commercial media, the mastermind, showed no remorse. A force of nature doesn't apologize for the storm. The ambitious musicians who had altered the songs for profit took the stand with a mix of defiance and quiet regret, arguing they had simply made a deal to survive in a world that was leaving them behind. And the community itself, the accomplice, sat in silent acceptance of its fate. They had already bought the radios and listened to the new songs. They had, in effect, already pled guilty. The verdict was swift and nearly unanimous. The ancient, bloody sagas of the mountains were found guilty on all counts, guilty of being too complex, too sorrowful, and too stubbornly local for a modern, optimistic nation. The sentence was not execution, but something far more final: obsolescence. They were to be banished from the front porch and the public square, remanded to the custody of a few dusty archives and forgotten collections, their stories replaced by a simpler, more cheerful narrative that sold more records. This verdict was, at the time, overwhelmingly popular. It was called Progress, Enlightenment, the inevitable march of history. But in this vast, impersonal courtroom, there was one man who refused to accept the judgment. Bascom Lamar Lunsford did not act as a lawyer for the defense. It was far too late for that. Instead, he appointed himself the court clerk for the condemned. He worked tirelessly, not to overturn the verdict, but to create a perfect, unassailable transcript of the proceedings. He recorded every last piece of evidence, every haunting testimony, not for this trial, but for an appeal to a higher court, the court of history. And so, while the world celebrated a victory, Lunsford preserved the memory of what was lost. He ensured that the case of the mountain ballads would never truly be closed. He created a file so thick with sorrow and beauty that future generations would be forced to reopen it, to re-examine the evidence and ask themselves a chilling question: was this justice, or was it a crime? It's a verdict that, thanks to him, still sparks arguments in these hills to this day. The verdict had been handed down, and the consequences rippled through the mountains for generations, changing the fate of everyone involved. The survivors of this cultural crime, the ballads themselves, were now safe, but forever altered. Rescued by Lunsford, they were no longer living, breathing stories shared on a porch. They became ghosts in a filing cabinet, their voices captured on wax cylinders and stored in the climate-controlled vaults of the Library of Congress. They were saved from extinction, but at the cost of their freedom. They had become specimens, butterflies pinned under glass, their beautiful, tragic patterns preserved, but their flight forever ended. For the community, the people of the mountains, the verdict of obsolete had a devastating, long-term effect. The silence that Lunsford had encountered became the new normal. A generation grew up disconnected from the bloody sagas that had once defined their ancestors' world. The caricature of the simple banjo-strumming hillbilly, once a condescending fiction, began to feel like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Many of the brightest young people, convinced that their heritage was a source of shame, left the mountains for the cities, leaving behind an aging population and a profound sense of cultural amnesia. They had been judged by the outside world, and in their hearts, many felt their own culture had been found wanting. The descendants of the guilty parties, meanwhile, thrived in ways no one could have predicted. The ambitious musicians who had sanitized the old songs for commercial appeal became the founding fathers of a global phenomenon. The DNA of their altered ballads, the simple chords, the narrative style, the themes of love and loss, mutated and evolved, becoming the bedrock of what the world would come to know as country music. In a bitter twist of fate, the very act of betrayal ensured a kind of immortality. The raw, uncomfortable truth of the mountains was gone, but its polished, commercially viable ghost now echoed from every radio in the nation. And so, the lives of everyone in those mountains were forever changed. A people who had once known exactly who they were, their identity rooted in a deep and often dark well of shared stories, were now set adrift. They inherited the accent, the family names, and the stunning, unforgiving landscape, but they had lost the lyrical map that explained what it all meant. They became haunted not by the ghosts of the old stories, but by the far more unsettling ghost of their absence. You might think the story ends there, in a dusty archive, with the final verdict rendered by a changing world. But if you know where to look, you can still find the evidence of Bascom Lamar Lunsford's investigation scattered all across these hills. The traces of his work have not vanished. They have simply sunk into the soil, becoming part of the landscape itself. The most tangible remnant of his crusade is the Mountain Dance and Folk Festival, which he founded in Asheville in 1928. It still happens every year. On a warm summer night, you can go there and see the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the very people he interviewed. You can see them playing the same banjos, dancing the same steps, and most importantly, singing the same songs. It is a living, breathing wake, a place where the ghosts Lunsford collected are brought out into the light, not to be mourned, but to be celebrated. It is his final, defiant piece of evidence, presented to a new jury year after year. The songs themselves are another echo. Thanks to the collection he so painstakingly assembled, the ballads did not die. They were rediscovered. The raw, haunting melodies he saved from oblivion became a wellspring for the American folk revival of the 1950s and 60s. When a modern artist stands on a stage in New York or London and sings the chilling tale of Tom Dooley, they are, whether they know it or not, calling on one of Lunsford's ghosts. His work ensured that these hyper-local tragedies became part of a universal human story. And the story of Lunsford himself has become a piece of Appalachian folklore. The whispers about the minstrel lawyer still linger. He is remembered not just as a collector, but as a mythical figure, a man who walked between worlds and knew the mountain's darkest secrets. The legend of the man who knew where the bodies were buried has outlived almost everyone who told it, a testament to the power of a man who listened so intently that he became part of the story he was trying to save. But the most powerful echo is in the land itself. The rivers where lovers were betrayed still flow. The sharp ridges that once divided warring families still cut across the sky. These places hold the memory of what happened there, etched into the very rock and soil. Bascom Lamar Lunsford's greatest achievement was not that he saved the songs, but that he saved the connection between the songs and the land. And now, when you hear one of those old ballads, it feels as if the mountain itself is singing, telling you its own dark and beautiful secrets. So we return to the question we asked at the beginning, around our digital campfire. What if a region's darkest secrets were carried not in books, but on a melody? We now have our answer. The secrets were a community's soul, its open wounds, its moral code, and its cautionary tales. And the strange man in the suit who collected them was more than a folklorist. He was a custodian of ghosts. Bascom Lamar Lunsford understood that these weren't just songs. They were the last, fading testimony of a world on trial, and he was the only lawyer willing to take the case. This is a story, then, not just of a man saving songs, but of the immense, often brutal price of progress. It is a timeless lesson on the seduction of forgetting. It teaches us that the most dangerous threat to a culture is rarely an invading army, but more often a quiet, internal whisper that tells us our own complicated, painful history is a burden we should lay down in favor of a simpler, brighter future. Lunsford's great crusade was a fight against this seductive silence, an argument that our scars are not meant to be hidden. They are proof that we have lived, and they are warnings that must never, ever be forgotten. Bascom Lamar Lunsford fought a war against the quiet death of memory, and in the end, he did not win. No one could. But he achieved something far more important. He ensured that the ghosts of Appalachia would never be homeless. He gave them a permanent refuge in the archives of a nation, and a voice that could still be heard by anyone willing to listen. And now, my friends, the story is yours to keep. The next time you hear an old, mournful tune carried on the wind, listen closely. It might not be the wind at all, but a story that, thanks to one stubborn man, refused to stay silent. On the morning of March 20th, 1906, the modern steel of the Walnut Street Bridge in Chattanooga, Tennessee, was host to a medieval horror. Dangling from a thick rope tied to a girder was the body of a man riddled with bullet holes, a silent silhouette against the rising sun. This wasn't a secret crime, hidden in the shadows. This was a public spectacle, a brutal message left for the entire city and the entire nation to see. The victim was a man named Ed Johnson, and just hours before his death, he had been granted a stay of execution by the United States Supreme Court. He was, by law, under federal protection. So what happened on that bridge? How could a mob tear a man from his cell and lynch him in open defiance of the highest court in the land? Today, we will answer that question. We will unravel a story of a city's rage, a sheriff's betrayal, and an injustice so profound it sparked an unprecedented legal battle for the very soul of America. Before he was a name in a Supreme Court case, Ed Johnson was just a man trying to find his way. He was 24 years old, a handyman, and a member of the Second Baptist Church. He wasn't a troublemaker. By all accounts, he was quiet, unassuming, and known for his steady work. In the segregated world of 1906 Chattanooga, a city trying to brand itself as a progressive hub of the New South, men like Ed Johnson lived a precarious existence. They were the backbone of the city's labor force, yet they were afforded none of its protections and lived under the constant unspoken threat of a racial hierarchy enforced by both law and tradition. His world was one of separate entrances, separate water fountains, and a carefully maintained social distance. He had hopes and fears like any other man, but his were filtered through the lens of Jim Crow. He sought stability, a bit of peace, and the quiet dignity of a life well lived within the narrow confines society had drawn for him. He was, in short, an ordinary man, which made him the perfect blank canvas onto which a city could project its deepest fears and hatreds. Miles away, In another part of that same city lived Nevada Taylor. She was a young white woman, and her world was the mirror opposite of Ed Johnson's, defined by a different set of rigid expectations. Her life was meant to be one of protected virtue, of church socials, and a future promised within the safe confines of her community. She was a symbol of the Southern purity that the white power structure was obsessed with defending. The city they both called home, Chattanooga, was a place of deep contradictions. It boasted of its industry, its economic growth, and the grand Walnut Street Bridge that stitched the city together over the Tennessee River. But beneath this veneer of progress was a simmering cauldron of racial animosity. The memory of the Civil War was still fresh, and the rigid social order of the Jim Crow South was considered sacred. The slightest perceived transgression against that order, especially the ultimate taboo of a black man being accused of harming a white woman, was enough to make the city's civilized facade crumble into dust. In this tinderbox, Ed Johnson and Nevada Taylor were strangers, their lives running on parallel tracks that were never meant to intersect. But on a cold January night, in the darkness of a cemetery on the edge of town, those tracks would collide in a catastrophic event. One of them would become the victim of a brutal assault, and the other the victim of a city's ravenous, indiscriminate rage. Both of their lives and the world they knew were about to be destroyed. The crime scene was not a room with four walls, but a sprawling, cold expanse of earth and stone, the Forest Hills Cemetery. By day, it was a place of quiet reflection. But on the night of January 23, 1906, this sanctuary for the dead became a stage for a living nightmare. The air was still, the only sounds the rustle of winter leaves and the distant whistle of a train. It was in this profound and unnerving silence that Nevada Taylor was found, terrified and disoriented. There was no physical evidence to speak of, no footprints that could be trusted on the hard, cold ground, no discarded weapon, no clear signs of a struggle that told a specific story. The only evidence was Nevada Taylor's own harrowing account, a story pieced together from the fragments of trauma and the blackness of the night. She couldn't see her attacker's face. She couldn't describe his clothes. All she could offer was a voice in the dark and the terrifying assertion that her assailant was a black man. From the chaos, investigators clung to a single flimsy piece of information. Miss Taylor mentioned that she had grabbed at something during the attack, a small leather strap, which she thought might have come from her assailant's weapon. This tiny, ambiguous detail became the cornerstone of the entire investigation. It was not a clue that pointed to a specific person, but a desperate anchor in a sea of uncertainty. The scene of the crime quickly expanded beyond the cemetery gates and into the very heart of Chattanooga. Whispers turned to shouts, and fear curdled into rage. The city's white populace didn't see a mystery to be solved. They saw an outrage to be avenged. The lack of a clear suspect didn't inspire caution. Instead, it created a vacuum that was instantly filled with suspicion directed at every black man in the city. The investigation began not with a question, who did this, but with a conclusion. A black man was responsible, and he would be found. The wilderness of the cemetery had offered no easy answers, but the mob-minded certainty of the city demanded one, and it demanded one immediately. The hunt was on, not for a specific individual, but for any man who could be made to fit the crime. The city's fury needed a face, a name to attach to its collective rage. That pressure fell squarely on the shoulders of Hamilton County Sheriff Joseph F. Shipp. A man of his time and place, Shipp understood that justice in the Jim Crow South was often secondary to maintaining order, and order meant placating the white majority. His personal vendetta wasn't against any one man, but against the threat of chaos and the political damage an unsolved crime of this nature could do to his career. He needed a culprit, and he needed one fast. The investigation became a brutal dragnet. Deputies swept through the black neighborhoods of Chattanooga, rounding up men by the dozen. It wasn't about finding clues. It was about creating a lineup of potential sacrifices. And in this trawl, they found Ed Johnson. He wasn't caught red-handed, nor was he found with any incriminating evidence. He was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, a known figure in the community who suddenly found himself ensnared in a nightmare. The flimsy clue of the leather strap was now given a purpose. A rumor began to circulate, likely started by the authorities themselves, that Johnson had been seen with a similar strap. It was a lie, but a powerful one. Suddenly, the community had something to latch onto. Ed Johnson fit the profile not because of evidence, but because he was available. He was a black man, he was young, and he was powerless. The entire weight of the investigation now shifted onto him. Every aspect of his quiet life was re-examined through a lens of presumed guilt. His unassuming nature was twisted into sullen secrecy, his work as a handyman seen as a cover for a darker character. The community didn't have a motive rooted in personal animosity, so they invented one for him. The racist, monstrous caricature of a black man driven by uncontrollable lust. A vile stereotype used for a century to justify racial violence. The mob had its villain. The Whispers had found their target. In the face of a lynch mob and a hostile legal system, a man has one last line of defense: his own lawyers. They are supposed to be his sword and his shield, the one party in the room bound by oath to fight for him, no matter the odds. For Ed Johnson, this sacred trust was placed in the hands of two court-appointed attorneys, W.G.M. Thomas and Robert Cameron. But this is where the story takes a chilling turn. The deepest betrayal wouldn't come from the mob in the streets, but from the very men sitting beside him at the defense table. There was no hidden affair or secret greed driving these men. Their motive was something far more common and far more poisonous. They simply did not believe their client was innocent. They were products of their time, white men of standing in a society that had already condemned Ed Johnson in its heart. To them, defending him was not a pursuit of justice, but an unpleasant professional obligation. A vigorous defense would mean alienating their peers, the judges, and the entire white community of Chattanooga. It was a battle they had no intention of fighting. Their actions in the courtroom, when re-examined, tell a story not of a failed defense, but of a defense that was never truly mounted. They met with Johnson only once, for a few minutes, before the trial began. They called no witnesses to the stand to testify to his character or to help establish an alibi. They offered only a timid, half-hearted cross-examination of the prosecution's witnesses. The trial was a sham, and his own lawyers were willing participants in the charade. The final, damning proof of their betrayal came after the inevitable guilty verdict was handed down. Ed Johnson, terrified but resolute in his innocence, begged them to file an appeal. They refused. In their eyes, the case was closed. They had performed their duty as they saw it, and now they were washing their hands of the condemned man. This wasn't just legal malpractice, it was an act of profound abandonment. Ed Johnson's supposed guardians had delivered him, bound and gagged, to his executioners. He was utterly and completely alone. Just when Ed Johnson's fate seemed sealed, a new and unexpected force entered the fray. It did not come from within Chattanooga's white power structure, but from outside of it, from a quarter no one had bothered to consider. Two local black attorneys, Noah Pardon and Stiles Hutchins, stepped out of the shadows. This was not just a legal maneuver, it was an act of almost unimaginable courage. In a city where they were considered second-class citizens, where their very ambition was seen as a provocation, they chose to stand up for a man everyone else had left for dead. Their motive was not profit or personal gain. It was a radical belief in the promise of American justice, even when America itself had broken that promise time and time again. They saw a sham trial, an innocent man railroaded, and a violation of the most basic constitutional rights. Their interest clashed directly with the unwritten law of the city, which demanded a swift execution to satisfy the mob. Pardon and Hutchins were not just fighting for Ed Johnson, they were challenging the entire corrupt edifice of Jim Crow justice. Their presence created an immediate and dangerous unease. They were threatened, intimidated, and ostracized. But they refused to back down. When the Tennessee Supreme Court slammed its doors in their face, they made a decision that would change legal history. They decided to appeal to an authority far outside the state, a power that the Chattanooga mob could not control, the Supreme Court of the United States. This was the ultimate external threat. The news that two black lawyers were taking their case to Washington, D.C. was seen as an outrageous act of defiance. To Sheriff Shipp and the city's leaders, this wasn't an appeal. It was an invasion. It was the federal government, the same force that had crushed the Confederacy 40 years prior, once again threatening to meddle in their affairs. The conflict was no longer just about Ed Johnson. It was a battle for control, a struggle between local mob rule and the supreme law of the land. The entire official investigation into the assault of Nevada Taylor was, from the very beginning, a grand and tragic false trail. The objective was never to find the truth, but to secure a conviction. The so-called clues that led to Ed Johnson were not discoveries, but constructions, red herrings deliberately laid to guide public opinion toward a predetermined conclusion. The central piece of evidence, the small leather strap, was the most potent of these fictions. Investigators treated it like a smoking gun, a direct link to Johnson, despite the fact that no one could ever definitively prove it belonged to him or that it was even connected to the crime. The trail led from this flimsy object to the Hamilton County Jail, where the most crucial piece of misdirection was staged. The identification of Ed Johnson by Nevada Taylor was not a moment of clarity, but of manufactured certainty. She was brought into a dim room where Johnson was the only suspect presented. Her initial hesitation, her uncertainty, was brushed aside by the forceful suggestions of the lawmen around her. Under immense pressure, she gave them the identification they wanted. This shaky, coerced statement, which should have been a dead end, was instead treated as an irrefutable fact. Meanwhile, any path that might have led to the truth was quickly blocked off. Ed Johnson had an alibi. Witnesses in the black community could place him at a saloon far from the cemetery at the time of the attack. But these leads, the only ones that actually pointed toward his innocence, were never pursued. The authorities simply weren't interested. Every testament to Johnson's good character, every inconsistency in the timeline, was ignored. These promising trails didn't evaporate. They were deliberately buried under the weight of the official narrative. This created a strange and dangerous kind of frustration. For Sheriff Shipp and the white mob, the frustration wasn't that the case was stalled, but that the legal process, however flawed, was taking too long. They had their man, their simple answer, and the appeals filed by Pardon and Hutchins were seen as infuriating obstacles. For the black community, the feeling was one of growing terror. They were watching a legal system actively lead itself down a false path, and they knew that at the end of this trail lay not justice, but a hangman's noose for an innocent man. In Chattanooga, the truth was not buried by a lack of evidence, but by two formidable walls of silence. The first was a wall built by the white community, not of quiet whispers, but of a deafening, unified roar. It was an unspoken agreement that Ed Johnson was guilty, a conclusion reached before the trial even began. This wasn't just about one crime, it was about defending a fragile social order. To question Johnson's guilt was to question the very foundation of their world, to suggest a white woman could be wrong and a black man could be innocent. Any white person who harbored doubts learned quickly to keep them to themselves, lest they be branded a sympathizer, a traitor to their own. The second wall was built by the black community, and it was a wall of pure, unadulterated terror. People knew Ed Johnson. They knew his character. Some even knew where he was on that fateful night. But the code of the Jim Crow South was brutally simple. You saw nothing, you heard nothing, and you knew nothing that contradicted the white mob. To come forward as an alibi witness for Johnson would not have been seen as a civic duty, but as an act of suicidal defiance. The price for speaking the truth was the firebombing of your home, the destruction of your business. or a rope thrown over a tree limb with your own name on it. This silence was born from a deep and justified distrust of the law. The police and the courts were not seen as protectors, but as the enforcement arm of the white power structure. To go to Sheriff Shipp with information proving Johnson's innocence would be pointless and perilous. The system was not designed to find the truth. It was designed to produce a result, and that result had already been decided. The psychological toll on those who dared to breach this wall was immediate and severe. Noah Pardon and Styles Hutchins were the ultimate examples. By taking Johnson's case, they shattered the silence. In return, they were marked men. Their lives were openly threatened, their reputations dragged through the mud. They were hunted in their own city, forced to flee for their very survival. The message sent to the rest of the community was chillingly clear. This is the fate of those who speak. After that, the silence became absolute. With the Tennessee courts turning a deaf ear and the execution date looming, all hope seemed to be lost. The legal road had run out, and the gallows were being prepared. But in the small office of Noah Pardon and Styles Hutchins, a discovery was made that would change the course of American legal history. The forgotten clue they unearthed wasn't a misplaced letter or a hidden diary. It was a fundamental principle that the state of Tennessee had chosen to ignore. It was the United States Constitution. Their argument was as simple as it was revolutionary. They contended that Ed Johnson had not received a trial by a jury of his peers, but had been condemned by a jury of intimidated hostages. A courtroom surrounded by an armed, bloodthirsty mob, they argued, is not a court of law. It is a stage for a legal lynching. This was not a failure of evidence, but a failure of the entire process, a gross violation of Johnson's right to due process under the 14th Amendment. This was their forgotten clue. The trial itself was the crime. With this powerful argument, they did the unthinkable. They bypassed the entire state judicial system and took their appeal directly to the highest court in the land. It was a desperate, audacious gamble, two lone black lawyers from the South petitioning the 9 most powerful jurists in America. And then, the impossible happened. The Supreme Court listened. Justice John Marshall Harlan, a man who had famously dissented in the Plessy versus Ferguson case that enshrined separate but equal, saw the profound injustice. On March 19, 1906, he granted a stay of execution. A telegram was dispatched from Washington, D.C. to Chattanooga. It was a single piece of paper, but it carried the full weight of the United States government, ordering a halt to the execution. The forgotten clue had not just opened a door, it had kicked it off its hinges. For a fleeting, miraculous moment, the law had prevailed. The case was no longer about one man's life. It was now a direct confrontation between the rule of law and the rule of the mob. The telegram from the Supreme Court should have been a shield, an impenetrable barrier of federal authority protecting Ed Johnson. Instead, in the charged atmosphere of Chattanooga, it acted like a lit match tossed into a powder keg. The news spread through the city not as a call for lawful patience, but as an intolerable insult. A distant court in Washington, they felt, had stolen their justice, robbing them of the vengeance they so desperately craved. The city began to simmer, and then to boil. The central mystery was no longer who attacked Nevada Taylor, but who would dare to defy the United States Supreme Court. The answer was not some shadowy figure hiding in the back alleys. The mastermind of the lynching, the man who held the keys to both the jail and to the mob's fury, was Hamilton County Sheriff Joseph F. Shipp. His unmasking came not from a forgotten clue, but from his own deliberate, chilling actions on the night of March 19th. His motive was a toxic cocktail of wounded pride, political calculation, and pure racist ideology. The Supreme Court's stay of execution was a direct and public humiliation. It was a declaration that he, the sheriff, had overseen a failed and unconstitutional trial. In his mind, his authority, his honor, and the honor of his community had been trampled by an interfering federal power. Faced with a choice between his oath to uphold the law of the land and his allegiance to the unwritten code of the mob, Sheriff Shipp made his decision. He would side with the mob. The unmasking is found in the sequence of his orders that night. First, he sent the vast majority of his deputies home, leaving the county jail, which held a man now at the center of a national firestorm, almost completely unguarded. Then, he personally disarmed the one remaining jailer, a man named Nicholson, leaving him with only a single, useless key. He had effectively laid out a welcome mat for the violence he knew was coming. The mob that gathered that night was not a spontaneous eruption of chaos. It was an organized force, its leaders emboldened by the silent, implicit permission of the sheriff. They marched on the jail not with the uncertainty of a riot, but with the confidence of men who knew they would face no resistance. When the sledgehammers began to ring against the jailhouse doors, the sound was not just breaking steel, but the shattering of the rule of law. The true culprits were unmasked, a furious mob acting as the fist, and the county sheriff, the man sworn to stop them, acting as the calculating, treacherous mind. The night air of Chattanooga filled with the rhythmic, brutal clang of steel on steel as the mob's sledgehammers beat against the jailhouse doors. Inside, a terrified Ed Johnson listened as his last line of defense was systematically battered into submission. When the doors finally gave way, a river of angry shouts and menacing faces flooded the corridor. Rough hands seized him, dragging him from the relative safety of his cell out into the cold March street. They marched him through the city, a grim procession lit by flickering torches and street lamps. The mob was a beast with 100 heads, and it was parading its victim towards the altar of its rage, the Walnut Street Bridge. The modern steel structure, a symbol of Chattanooga's progress, became a stage for its most medieval impulse. The dark, swirling waters of the Tennessee River flowed silently below, an indifferent witness to the horror about to unfold. On the bridge, under the vast, starless sky, a thick rope was thrown over a steel girder. In this final, terrifying moment, Ed Johnson was granted a chance to speak. His voice, clear and steady, cut through the jeers of the crowd. He did not beg for his life. He proclaimed his truth. "I am an innocent man," he declared to the faces surrounding him. "I am not guilty of this crime. I have said it all the time and I say it now. God bless you all. I am ready to go." Then he was pushed into the void. The rope snapped taut, but the fall did not bring a swift end. As his body twisted in the air, a leader of the mob raised a pistol. A single sharp crack echoed across the river, and Johnson's body went limp. It was followed by another and another. From the bridge above, a fusillade of gunfire erupted. The night was filled with muzzle flashes, each bright spark followed by the sound of a shot, over 50 in all, each one a punctuation mark in a statement of pure defiance. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. A ringing silence descended upon the bridge, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the steel girders and the distant bark of a dog. Ed Johnson's body hung motionless, a haunting pendulum suspended between the city and the dark river below. The mob, its terrible work done, quietly began to disperse, leaving their gruesome message hanging in the night for all the world to see. News of the lynching in Chattanooga was not just news of a murder, it was news of a rebellion. The mob, aided by the sheriff, had not just killed a man, they had openly defied a direct order from the United States Supreme Court. The insult was so profound, so audacious, that it shook the halls of power in Washington. President Theodore Roosevelt himself condemned it as a hideous crime. The Supreme Court, its authority fundamentally challenged, decided to do something it had never done before and has never done since. It resolved to hold its own criminal trial. The atmosphere was unlike any other in American history. The case of United States versus Shipp was not held in a Tennessee courthouse filled with angry locals, but before the 9 justices of the Supreme Court. The defendants, Sheriff Shipp and several leaders of the mob, were summoned to the nation's capital. They walked into the proceedings not with the demeanor of contrite men, but with a quiet, stubborn defiance. Back home, they were heroes who had upheld the Southern Code. In Washington, they were seen as insurrectionists. They were not on trial for murder. The federal court had no jurisdiction for that, but for something just as fundamental, contempt of court, for spitting in the face of the highest law in the land. Shipp and his men maintained their innocence, claiming they were simply overwhelmed by a spontaneous and uncontrollable mob. They presented themselves as hapless peacekeepers, not willing conspirators. But the evidence, painstakingly gathered by federal investigators, told a different story. A story of deputies sent home, of a jail left intentionally unguarded, of a sheriff who had promised the mob they would not be stopped. The verdict, when it finally came down in 1909, was a thunderclap. The Supreme Court of the United States found Sheriff Joseph F. Shipp and 5 of his associates guilty. It was a seismic moment, the first time the federal government had successfully prosecuted the participants of a lynch mob. But then came the sentence. For orchestrating the murder of a man under federal protection and for defying the highest court in the land, Sheriff Shipp was sentenced to serve just 60 days in a federal jail. Justice, it seemed, had been both served and denied in the very same breath. The verdict established a monumental precedent. The rule of law could and would reach down to challenge mob violence, but the punishment was so laughably light that it felt like a slap on the wrist. Shipp served his time and returned to Chattanooga not as a disgraced criminal, but as a celebrated martyr, his reputation enhanced by his brief and comfortable imprisonment. The verdict was a landmark victory for the principle of law, but a bitterly hollow one for the cause of true justice. The lives of everyone touched by the tragedy of Ed Johnson were permanently fractured, their futures sent spinning in new and often tragic directions. For the 2 men who fought for him, Noah Pardon and Styles Hutchins, the price of their courage was exile. They were hounded from the city they sought to better, their legal practices destroyed, and their lives under constant threat. They became fugitives from the very mob they had tried to defeat in a courtroom, forced to rebuild their lives in the anonymity of the North, their names whispered in Chattanooga's black community with a mixture of reverence and fear. They had won a moral victory, but suffered a devastating personal defeat. The opposite was true for Sheriff Joseph Shipp. He did not return from his 60-day sentence in shame. He was welcomed back to Chattanooga as a conquering hero. He walked the streets not as a convicted criminal who had defied the Supreme Court, but as a champion of Southern honor who had stood up to federal overreach. His complicity in the lynching did not end his career. It solidified his legacy among the white majority. He became a living symbol of the South's defiance, his life a testament to the fact that in the Jim Crow era, some crimes were not only tolerated, but celebrated. Nevada Taylor, the young woman whose assault was the catalyst for the entire nightmare, retreated into a life of quiet obscurity. The trauma of that night in the cemetery was compounded by the horror of what was done in her name. She never spoke publicly of the events again, living out her days in the long shadow of a crime she survived and a murder she inadvertently caused. Her life, like Johnson's, was irrevocably defined by that one terrible night. For the black community of Chattanooga, the lynching of Ed Johnson became a ghost story told for generations, a brutal lesson in the consequences of defiance. It cast a pall of fear that lingered for decades, reinforcing the city's rigid racial hierarchy with the haunting image of a body hanging from the Walnut Street Bridge. But a seed of resolve was also planted. The fight for Ed Johnson's name did not die with him. It was a slow, stubborn pursuit of justice that spanned nearly a century, a legal and moral reckoning passed down through the years, waiting for a time when the city would finally be forced to confront its past. If you walk across Chattanooga's Walnut Street Bridge today, you will see a city reborn. It is now a pedestrian walkway, a beautiful expanse of blue steel where families stroll, cyclists glide by, and tourists take photos of the Tennessee River below. It is a symbol of the city's vibrant present. But the steel beneath your feet tells a different story. The massive girders that support this scene of modern leisure are the very same girders from which a noose was hung in 1906. The bridge is not just a landmark, it is a monument to a murder, a tangible physical remnant of a night of profound horror. For nearly a century, the official story of Ed Johnson was a ghost, a tale whispered in the black community but largely erased from the city's public memory. But ghosts have a way of demanding to be seen. In the year 2000, 94 years after his death, the Hamilton County Court officially overturned Ed Johnson's conviction, a stunning and long overdue admission of the injustice that had been done. The echo of his last words, "I am an innocent man," had finally found its way back into a courtroom and been affirmed as truth. Today, not far from the foot of that very bridge, a new monument stands. It is the Ed Johnson Memorial, a solemn and powerful space dedicated to his memory and to the courage of Noah Pardon and Styles Hutchins. It is a deliberate act of reclamation, a place where the story is no longer whispered but told in bronze and stone for all to see. It stands as a counter-narrative to the silence, a permanent testament to a history that the city is finally beginning to confront. The mountains that cradle Chattanooga have seen empires rise and fall, and the river has carried 1,000 secrets to the sea. They were the silent witnesses to the crime, the trial, and the lynching. For decades, the world tried to forget what happened on that bridge, to pave over the past with progress. But the steel remembers, the river remembers. And now, thanks to the tireless pursuit of justice, the city is finally being forced to remember too, ensuring that the echo of Ed Johnson's story will never again fade into silence. So we return to the question that hung in the air with Ed Johnson's body. How could this happen in open defiance of the nation's highest court? The answer, we now know, is as simple as it is terrifying. The law is not a fortress of stone. It is a fragile agreement, utterly dependent on the integrity of those sworn to uphold it. On that night in Chattanooga, the man with the badge decided the mob's will was more important than the court's word, and in that moment, the law ceased to exist. But this story is more than just a chronicle of a failure of justice. It is a profound lesson in the slow, stubborn, and often painful pursuit of it. It teaches us that the arc of the moral universe may bend toward justice, as the saying goes, but it does not bend on its own. It must be pulled, inch by painful inch, by the hands of courageous and often forgotten people. Men like Noah Pardon and Styles Hutchins, who risked everything for a man they knew was innocent, pulled on that arc. Their fight seemed lost in 1906, but it started a conversation that refused to die, a quiet echo that grew louder with each passing generation. The story of Ed Johnson is a reminder that history is never truly in the past. It lives in the steel of a bridge, in the names carved on a memorial, and in the ongoing struggle to reconcile our ideals with our actions. The Supreme Court's verdict was a landmark for the rule of law, but the real justice, the clearing of an innocent man's name, took nearly a century to arrive. It is a story that teaches us that the loudest shouts for truth often come from the quietest graves. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story. You know how the law can be both a shield and a sword, and how sometimes it is simply a whisper in a storm of rage. For the law can be written on paper, but justice must be carved into the heart of a community. And that is a task that is never truly finished. Two days shy of her 41st birthday, shotgun blasts ripped through the quiet hills of the Indian Territory. She was shot in the back, a coward's ambush. The woman they called the Bandit Queen lay dead in the dirt, just feet from her own gate. The dime novels painted her as a female Jesse James, a ruthless outlaw. But that's the legend. How does a girl who mastered Greek and the piano, born to a respectable family, end her days this way? Today, we separate the truth from the lies to find the real Myra Maybelle Shirley and to ask the question that still haunts these hills: who wanted her dead? Before the legend, there was a girl named Myra Maybelle Shirley. She wasn't born in a dusty outlaw camp, but into a life of relative comfort in Carthage, Missouri. Her father, John Shirley, was a respected farmer, innkeeper, and judge, a man of property and standing. Their home sat on the very edge of civilization, where the rolling prairies gave way to the rugged ancient Ozark Hills. It was a land with a soul much like Appalachia's, a place of tight-knit clans, fierce independence, and memories as long and deep as the valleys themselves. The roots of that spirit ran deep in Myra's blood. Her mother, Elizabeth Hatfield Shirley, came from the same line as the notorious Hatfields of the West Virginia-Kentucky border. This wasn't just a distant relation, it was a heritage. It meant that Myra was born into a world where honor was defended with fists and firearms, where loyalty to family was the highest law, and where an insult was a debt that would one day be paid in full. This was the unwritten code of the mountains, a code she understood long before she ever read a law book. On the surface, however, Myra was being molded into a proper Southern lady. Her father sent her to the Carthage Female Academy, a place of refinement and learning. She studied the classics, mastered Greek and Latin, and could fill the Shirley home with the beautiful, complex notes of a piano sonata. She was intelligent, articulate, and poised, everything a daughter of a prominent family was expected to be. She was destined for a life of quiet dignity, of ball gowns and polite conversation. But beneath the corset and silk beat the heart of a rebel. The same girl who could quote Greek philosophers was more at home in the saddle, racing her horse through the woods with a freedom most women of her time could only dream of. She preferred the company of her older brother, Bud, and his friends, learning from them the ways of the wilderness. She could handle a shotgun with a skill that shamed grown men and knew the hidden trails of the Ozarks as if they were lines on the palm of her hand. Two worlds were at war inside this young woman: the polished, respectable world her father was building for her, and the wild, untamed world of the hills that flowed in her Hatfield blood. For a time, she could walk in both. But a storm was gathering on the horizon of America, a storm of fire and steel that would sweep across the nation, and it would force Myra Maybelle Shirley to choose, once and for all, which world she truly belonged to. Little did she know that choice would burn the life she knew to the ground. If the Ozark Hills were the anvil of Myra's character, the Civil War was the hammer that shattered it and reforged it into something hard and sharp. When the war came, it didn't just divide the nation, it ripped through Missouri, turning neighbor against neighbor in a savage guerrilla conflict. The Shirley family didn't hesitate. Their loyalty was to the Confederacy, and their home soon became a clandestine way station for the most feared Southern partisans, the bushwhackers. Men like William Quantrill and Bloody Bill Anderson, men who fought with a cold fury, found refuge under the Shirley roof. And riding with them were boys who would become legends in their own right, the James brothers and the Younger brothers. This was the world that consumed Myra Maybelle. She saw these men not as outlaws, but as heroes defending their homes. And her greatest hero was her own brother, Edwin, whom everyone called Bud. He was everything she admired: brave, defiant, and free. When he joined the bushwhackers, Myra's war began. The polite young lady from the academy vanished, replaced by a cunning operative for the Southern cause. Legends say she would use her charm and education to flirt with Union officers, prying information from them about troop movements, which she would then pass on to her brother and his comrades. She became a scout, a spy, a vital part of the shadow war being fought in the Missouri hills. For a time, it must have felt like a dangerous, righteous adventure. She was fighting alongside her brother, defending her family's beliefs. The risk was real, but so was the adrenaline, the sense of purpose. She was no longer just a girl playing piano, she was a player in the great bloody drama of her time. But this was no adventure. And the price of this war was about to be brought to her door in the most brutal way imaginable. In 1864, the hammer fell. Federal troops, tired of the constant raids and ambushes, hunted down Bud Shirley. He was trapped, cornered, and killed. For 16-year-old Myra, the news wasn't just devastating, it was the end of her world. The light of her life, her protector, her idol, was gone, slain by the very men she saw as foreign invaders. In that moment, her girlish patriotism and grief curdled into something far darker, a cold, permanent, all-consuming hatred. A hatred for the government, for its uniforms, for its laws. They had taken her brother, and in doing so, they had taken a part of her soul. The war might end for the country, but for Myra Shirley, it would never be over. She would spend the rest of her life fighting the victors. After the war, the Shirley family fled to Texas, seeking a new life from the ashes of the old. But for Myra, peace was a foreign country. Her heart, forged in hatred, was drawn to the fire. She found that fire in the eyes of the men who, like her brother Bud, refused to surrender. Men like the charismatic Cole Younger, a childhood friend and now a notorious outlaw. Rumors would later whisper of a passionate affair, claiming her daughter Pearl was his. It was a romantic story, but likely just that, a story. The truth, however, was no less dangerous. Her first husband was Jim Reed, another former bushwhacker who couldn't trade his pistol for a plow. With him, Myra stepped fully into the world of the outlaw. Their life was a blur of stolen horses and dodging posses, a frantic existence on the run. In this chaos, her two children, Pearl and Eddie, were born. But this was no family portrait. It was a partnership born of war and rebellion, and it was destined to end in blood. In 1874, Jim Reed's luck ran out. The news that reached Myra was cold and brutal. Her husband had been shot down, not in a blaze of glory, but by an acquaintance who valued the reward money more than friendship. At 26, Myra was a widow, a mother of two, and officially branded the accomplice of a dead bandit. This was the world she had chosen, a world with no honor among thieves. So she moved deeper into the shadows, to a place where the law of the United States was thin and the old ways were strong, the Indian Territory of Oklahoma. There, she met and married Sam Starr, a man from a proud Cherokee family. This wasn't just a marriage, it was the founding of a dynasty. On their land, tucked away in the rugged hills, they established a stronghold. It had a name that was a tribute to her old friends and a warning to her new enemies: Younger's Bend. Younger's Bend wasn't a ranch. It was a sanctuary for the damned. It was a place where men on the run, men like Jesse James and the Younger brothers themselves, could find a hot meal, a fresh horse, and a place to lay low, protected by the cunning of its queen. The air there was thick with the smell of wood smoke, whiskey, and paranoia. Every rider on the horizon was either a friend or a hangman. This was the heart of darkness, a kingdom built on stolen goods and guarded by guns. Here, the final transformation of Myra Maybelle Shirley was complete. She was no longer just a bandit's wife, she was the mastermind. She never led a charge, her hands weren't on the triggers during the robberies. Her weapons were her intellect and her will. She planned the heists, fenced the stolen property, bribed officials, and used her deep knowledge of the law to tangle up prosecutors in court. And she crafted an image that became a legend. She would ride into town on a fine horse, sitting side-saddle in a velvet dress like a proper lady, but on her hips, for all the world to see, rested two Colt revolvers. She could quote classical poetry one moment and arrange the sale of a stolen herd the next. This walking contradiction, the refined lady and the criminal queen, was her armor and her declaration of war. She had created a monster, and her name was Belle Starr. The two shotgun blasts echoed through the hills and then faded into an unnerving quiet. Belle Starr's horse, spooked and riderless, galloped the rest of the way to the ranch house, its panicked whinny the first alarm. Her daughter Pearl, hearing the sound, ran out to see what was wrong. The discovery she made in the mud of the road, just outside their own gate, would become the final bloody chapter of her mother's legend. The bandit queen was dead, her velvet riding habit stained with the earth and her own blood, her back riddled with buckshot. News of a murder like that travels fast, even in the isolated Indian territory. It moved from ranch to ranch on the lips of breathless riders, then crackled across the telegraph wires to the newspapers in Fort Smith and beyond. The death of Belle Starr was an event. For the lawmen, it was the closing of a long and frustrating case file. For the dime novelists, it was a dramatic ending they couldn't have written better themselves. For the locals, it was a source of fear and feverish gossip. The queen was dead, but who had dared to kill her? Soon enough, Deputy U.S. Marshals rode down the trail to Younger's Bend. For years, this place had been a no-go zone, a sanctuary for fugitives where the law entered at its own peril. Now, they were in charge, picking through the life of the woman who had so often made fools of them. The investigation began, and the web of suspects was tangled and dark, spun from the threads of Belle's own life. Every person in her orbit had a potential motive. The first and most obvious suspect was a man named Edgar Watson. He was a tenant on Belle's land, a man with a shadowy past from Florida, rumored to be wanted for murder himself. They had argued bitterly. Belle wanted him gone, and Watson wasn't a man who liked being told what to do. It was a simple, logical motive, a dispute over land and money that ended in violence. But the simple answer isn't always the true one. Then there was her own husband, a Cherokee man named Jim July Starr. He was younger than Belle and was, at the time of her murder, facing his own trial for horse theft. Did they have a falling out? Was he driven by jealousy? Or, as some whispered, did he arrange the murder to silence her before she could testify in some secret deal with the law? He had an alibi, but in the murky world of Younger's Bend, an alibi was just another story. The silence that fell over the hills wasn't one of peace. It was a silence of fear. Belle's network of outlaws scattered, not knowing who among them might be next, or who might sell them out for a pardon. A reward was posted for information, but few dared to speak. The killer was still out there, and no one knew how far their reach extended. The hunt was on, not just for a murderer, but for the truth behind the final bloody act of the bandit queen's life. The wheels of justice turned slowly, but in the case of Belle Starr's murder, they seemed to grind through mud. The primary suspect, Edgar Watson, was finally brought to trial. You can just imagine the scene in the Fort Smith courtroom. It wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was a spectacle. The room was packed with a tense mix of lawmen, curious townsfolk, and shadowed figures in the back rows, friends and enemies of the dead woman, all there to see how this final chapter would play out. The air itself felt heavy, thick with whispered theories and cold stares. Everyone had an opinion, and everyone was waiting for a conviction. The prosecution laid out its case. They painted a picture of a bitter dispute between a landlord and her troublesome tenant. They spoke of threats exchanged, of Watson's notorious temper, and of his presence near the scene of the crime. They presented him as a man with a motive, the means, and the opportunity. But their case was like a house built on sand. There was no murder weapon. There were no direct eyewitnesses to the shooting. The entire argument rested on bad blood and circumstantial evidence, a foundation that began to crumble under the slightest pressure. Watson, for his part, sat there with a cold confidence. He was no frightened farmer caught in the gears of the law. This was a man who understood the violence of the world. His defense lawyers didn't just deny his guilt. They threw the courtroom doors wide open to the chaos of Belle's life. They argued that putting only Edgar Watson on trial was absurd. Why not her husband, Jim July, who had his own legal troubles? Why not any of the dozens of spurned lovers, jilted partners, or vengeful victims Belle had created over the years? To have an enemy, they argued, was to be Belle Starr's acquaintance. And then, the darkest rumor of all, a chilling whisper that slithered through the courtroom, gave everyone pause. The story of Belle and her own son, Eddie. Their relationship was poison. He was a disappointment, and she was a harsh mother. The gossip was that just before her death, she had taken a whip to him for mistreating her favorite horse. Had the boy's resentment finally boiled over into an unspeakable act? Could he have pulled the trigger himself, or perhaps paid Watson to do it for him? It was a monstrous thought, but in the world Belle had built, it wasn't an impossible one. Faced with a weak case and a sea of reasonable doubt, the jury was trapped. They could condemn a man on suspicion, or they could let a potential killer walk free. They deliberated, and when they returned, the foreman's voice cut through the silence. "Not guilty." A shockwave went through the room. Edgar Watson, the man everyone was so sure had done it, stood up and walked out of the courtroom a free man. And so, the law of men had spoken. But was it justice? Or was it just a failure of a system that couldn't comprehend the complex, violent world of Younger's Bend? The court case was closed, but the murder remained unsolved. The killer had vanished back into the hills, becoming just another ghost in the bloody history of the territory. The truth, it seemed, was buried with the bandit queen. The murder of Belle Starr wasn't the end of the story. It was the explosion that scattered the pieces. Her kingdom, Younger's Bend, crumbled without its queen. The outlaws who had found sanctuary there drifted away, seeking new shadows to hide in. The land itself was eventually swallowed up by the relentless tide of settlement and progress. Today, what was once the most notorious hideout in the Indian Territory lies quiet and still, submerged beneath the placid waters of Lake Eufaula. A concrete historical marker stands on a nearby hill, a lone sentinel pointing toward the drowned land, the only official sign that this infamous chapter of the West ever happened here. The fates of those in her orbit were as tangled and often as tragic as her own. Edgar Watson, the acquitted suspect, moved on, but his reputation followed him. He eventually met a violent end himself, gunned down by a vigilante mob in Florida. Her last husband, Jim July Starr, died in a gunfight with lawmen not long after Belle's murder. Her son, Eddie Reed, who some whispered was the true killer, lived a troubled life, eventually becoming a deputy sheriff himself before being killed in a saloon brawl. It seems the violence that Belle had courted her whole life clung to those she left behind, an inescapable inheritance. But there is one final strange twist. Her daughter Pearl, the one rumored to be Cole Younger's child, chose a different path of rebellion. She turned her back on the world of guns and stolen horses and moved to Fort Smith, where she opened a high-class brothel. In a way, she too became a queen, presiding over her own illicit kingdom, a world with its own codes and dangers, just a stone's throw from the courthouse where her mother's killer had been set free. The strongest echo of Belle Starr, however, is not in the ground, but in the story itself. After her death, the legend took on a life of its own. A journalist named Richard Fox penned a lurid book called Belle Starr, the Bandit Queen, or the Female Jesse James. It was a work of pure fiction, filled with sensational tales of her leading bank robberies and stagecoach heists, things she never actually did. This book, and the countless dime novels that followed, created the image we think of today, the pistol-packing outlaw in a feathered hat. The myth completely consumed the woman. You can still visit her grave, tucked away in the woods not far from where Younger's Bend once stood. The original headstone, carved with a bell, a star, and a poignant poem, was chipped away to nothing by souvenir hunters over the decades. A new, protected monument stands in its place. And as you stand there, in the quiet of those Oklahoma hills, you realize the mountains do remember. They remember the real Myra Maybelle Shirley, The educated girl, the grieving sister, the cunning organizer, and the woman who gambled her life on a defiant dream of freedom and lost. So we return to the question that has hung in the air since those shotgun blasts first rang out. Who killed Belle Starr? The law of men never gave us a name. Was it the vengeful tenant, Edgar Watson? Was it one of her own family, a final, terrible betrayal? We will never know for sure. But maybe the real answer isn't a name. Maybe what killed Belle Starr was the violent, lawless world she had so carefully constructed around herself. In the end, the snake she had nurtured in the heart of Younger's Bend finally turned and bit its queen. Her story is a powerful reminder that the Civil War didn't truly end at Appomattox. It continued to rage in the hearts of people like Myra Shirley, leaving scars that festered into a deep and abiding hatred for the authority that had won. She was not a hero. She was not the cartoon villain of the penny press. She was a casualty, a woman whose fierce mountain pride, when poisoned by grief, became a force of self-destruction. She waged a 25-year war against a world she felt had wronged her, and in that war, there could only be one victor. Myra Maybelle Shirley was a woman of stark contradictions, the educated lady who could quote the classics and the ruthless godmother who ruled a den of thieves. She was born with the spirit of the mountains in her blood, proud, defiant, and unforgiving. But that spirit, when broken, forged a legend written in gunsmoke and blood. A girl who was meant to be a lady became the bandit queen, a cautionary tale that still echoes in the hills where she once rode. Imagine waking one morning to find a bundle of freshly cut willow branches tied to your front door. In the lawless hills of 19th century Kentucky, this wasn't a gift. It was an ultimatum, a final warning from a secret army that judged you in the dead of night. They called themselves the White Caps, angels of justice who promised to bring order to a land drowning in chaos. But the whispers that still echo through these hollows tell a different story. A story of how saviors became monsters and how the quest for justice turned into a thirst for blood and power. How did a committee of concerned farmers become a hooded terror that ruled by the whip and the rope? Today, we separate the legend from the brutal truth and uncover the story of the Whitehead clan. To understand the White Caps, you first have to understand their world. Picture the mountains of eastern Kentucky in the years after the Civil War. This wasn't just a place, it was a world apart, a labyrinth of fog-shrouded hollows and impassable ridges that kept the modern world at bay. Life here was governed not by clocks or calendars, but by the rising of the sun and the turning of the seasons. Families lived on isolated farmsteads, miles from their nearest neighbor, carving out a life from the stubborn, rocky soil. The creek was their water, the forest their larder, and the Bible their law. The people who called these mountains home were a proud and fiercely independent stock. They were veterans of a bitter war, farmers and blacksmiths who asked for little and expected even less from outsiders. Their lives were hard, a constant struggle against the elements and the land itself, but there was an honesty to it. A man's worth was measured by the strength of his hands and the truth of his word. They wanted nothing more than to raise their children, work their land, and be left in peace under the watchful eye of God. But a shadow was falling over this simple life. In the dark corners of this isolated world, a rot had begun to set in. With no effective law to speak of, the worst of human nature was allowed to fester. There were the drunks who would trade their family's last bit of flour for a jug of corn liquor. There were the petty thieves who would steal a neighbor's livestock in the dead of night, knowing there would be no consequences. And there were the family tyrants, men who ruled their homes with a fist, whose wives and children suffered in terrified silence. For these people, justice was a distant rumor, a story told about faraway cities. The local sheriff was often a man who either lacked the courage to enforce the law or was corrupt enough to ignore it for a price. To take a grievance to the county court was an expensive days-long journey that most couldn't afford, and even then, a mountain man's word meant little to a flatland judge. Honest, hard-working families felt powerless, watching as the fabric of their community was torn apart by men who feared neither God nor government. A quiet desperation began to settle over the valleys. It was a feeling shared in hushed conversations around the pot-bellied stove at the general store and in prayers whispered in small clapboard churches. People felt abandoned, left to fend for themselves against the growing chaos. And in that fertile ground of fear and frustration, a dangerous seed was planted. It was the old mountain idea that when the law fails, men must make their own. They didn't know it yet, but they weren't just seeking justice. They were about to unleash a terror far worse than anything they had ever known. The change didn't happen overnight. It didn't start with a gunshot or a hanging, but with a whisper. A whisper that traveled from farm to farm, a shared frustration that finally found a voice in a secret meeting in an old barn. They were respected men, farmers, veterans, even a preacher or two, men who had simply had enough. They decided that if the law wouldn't protect their families, they would become the law. They took a name for themselves, the White Caps, and for their uniform, they chose the simplest, most terrifying disguise imaginable, a plain white sack with holes cut for eyes. Their first target was a man known throughout the valley for his drunken cruelty, a man who beat his wife and starved his children while he spent his days in a stupor. One morning, he awoke to find that silent message on his door, a bundle of willow switches. It was a clear ultimatum, understood by everyone in the mountains. Straighten up or face the consequences. The man, arrogant in his belief that no one would dare challenge him, laughed it off. He threw the branches into his fire and went back to his bottle. It was the last mistake he would ever make in that county. A few nights later, the community learned what happened when a warning was ignored. A procession of silent riders, their faces hidden beneath those stark white hoods, descended on the man's cabin. There were no shouts, no threats. They moved with a chilling purpose, pulling the terrified man from his bed. They dragged him out into the cold night air, his wife's pleas echoing unanswered in the darkness. They tied him to a tree and one by one took up the same kind of willow switches he had burned and delivered their brutal judgment. It wasn't just a beating, it was a ritual of public shaming, a message delivered not only to him, but to everyone. When it was over, they gave him a new ultimatum: be gone by sunrise, or they would return. The next morning, the man, broken and bleeding, gathered his few belongings and left the county forever. And a strange quiet fell over the valley. The theft stopped. The town drunkards stayed home. For the first time in years, there was a sense of order. The White Caps had proven that their methods worked. They had tasted power, the absolute power to inspire fear and enforce their will. And in that moment of victory, without realizing it, they had crossed a line from which there was no return. The first drops of blood had been spilled not to kill, but to correct. Yet they had watered a seed that would soon grow into a monstrous tree. The taste of power is a poison, and it didn't take long for it to blacken the souls of the White Caps. The original mission of punishing drunks and thieves was forgotten, replaced by a much more profitable enterprise: fear for hire. Now, a man could pay the clan to settle a land dispute in his favor. A jealous husband could arrange a visit for a rival. The white hood was no longer a symbol of justice. It had become a mask for greed, revenge, and pure, unadulterated terror. The willow switch was no longer enough. The lessons they taught now were final. Their new reign was cemented not by punishing the guilty, but by making an example of the innocent. Consider the story of a farmer, a man respected for his honesty and hard work. His only crime was courage. He had stood up in a public place and called the Whitecaps what they had become, a gang of cowardly bandits who hid their faces. He refused to join them, refused to be silent. He knew the risk, but his mountain pride would not let him bow to them. The Whitecaps heard his words, and a death sentence was passed in the shadows. One moonless night, the family's dogs, usually fierce protectors, let out a single terrified yelp before falling silent. A moment later, the cabin door didn't just open, it exploded inward, splintering off its leather hinges. Silent figures, more like ghosts than men in their white hoods, filled the small room. They said nothing. They simply pointed a finger at the father of the house, who had just sat up in his bed. The children, frozen in terror in their small cots, could only see flickering shadows and hear the sounds of a nightmare that would be seared into their memory forever. His wife threw herself at the intruders, begging, pleading, but she was thrown aside like a rag doll. They dragged the man from his home, his bare feet scraping on the cold, hard-packed dirt of the yard. His family was forced to remain inside the cabin, captives in their own home, made to watch through the shattered doorway. They saw the torchlight glinting on a rope as it was thrown over the thick branch of an old oak tree. They were being made to bear witness. This wasn't just a murder, it was a lesson, and his family were the first pupils. The children covered their ears, but it did no good. The night was filled with the sounds of a brief, desperate struggle, a man's choked gasps for air, and then a sickening, heavy snap that echoed through the hollow. After that, nothing. Just the creak of the rope and the chirping of the crickets, who seemed entirely indifferent to the horror that had just unfolded. The world had turned into a hell of screams, followed by a ringing, absolute silence that was somehow even worse. The hooded figures didn't linger. They melted back into the woods as silently as they had come, leaving the torch sputtering in the dirt. They left behind a grieving family and a dark shape twisting gently in the night breeze. When the first grey light of dawn touched the mountain, the neighbors would find the scene. They would see the unspeakable trophy hanging from that oak tree, and they would understand the Whitecaps' new gospel. Keep your head down, keep your mouth shut, because in these mountains, speaking the truth was a sin punishable by death. When the sun finally rose, its light did little to chase away the darkness. It only served to illuminate the horror. The first neighbor to pass by stopped dead in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. He didn't run for the sheriff. He didn't cry out in alarm. He simply turned his wagon around and went to fetch other men, speaking in low, grim whispers. There was no question of who had done this. The sight of the body, a terrible monument to the price of defiance, was a signature left by the Whitecaps. Quietly, with grim reverence, the men cut him down and carried him back to his grieving family, their faces hard masks of fear and fury they dared not express. For the widow and her children, the world had ended. Their home was no longer a sanctuary, but a tomb haunted by the final moments of a man they loved. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside was a fresh wave of terror. They couldn't stay. There was no justice to be found here, only the constant, suffocating presence of the murderers, who could be any of the men they saw every day. Their fight was not for justice, but for survival. Within a week, they packed what little they could carry, abandoned the farm their family had worked for generations, and disappeared, becoming refugees from their own home. Their departure sent a clear message to the entire county. The Whitecaps had won. A thick, suffocating blanket of silence fell over the hills and hollows. No one spoke of the murder above a whisper, and never to an outsider. The code of silence was now absolute. A new, more insidious fear took root, a paranoia that turned neighbor against neighbor. Who was hiding beneath those hoods? The man who sold you flour at the general store? The blacksmith who shod your horse? Even the preacher who spoke of God's law on Sunday? You could trust no one. An invisible empire was being built, and its mortar was the blood of good men. The local sheriff eventually rode out to the abandoned farmstead. He looked at the rope burns on the oak branch, asked a few half-hearted questions to neighbors who suddenly couldn't remember a thing, and wrote a report he knew would lead nowhere. Perhaps he was a coward, too afraid of the hooded men to conduct a real investigation. Or perhaps, and this was the most chilling thought of all, he was one of them, his badge just another mask he wore during the day. His visit was a formality, a hollow gesture that only proved one thing: the law of men had no power here anymore. The hunt for the culprits never began. How could it? You can't arrest a ghost, and the Whitecaps had become something more than men in the terrified minds of the people. They were specters of vengeance, ghost riders who emerged from the night fog to enforce their own brutal commandments. The story of the murdered farmer became a cautionary tale whispered to children, a local legend born from a truth too terrible to confront directly. The ashes of his life had fertilized the soil of their fear, and from it, the Whitecaps' reign of terror would grow unopposed, casting a long, dark shadow over the mountains. Terror cannot last forever. Eventually, a monster will devour itself. The Whitecaps grew too bold, too greedy, and their violence became indiscriminate. When they murdered the family of a state legislator over a petty land dispute, they finally crossed a line that even the cowed local authorities couldn't ignore. The outside world came flooding into the mountains, not with sheriffs this time, but with stone-faced U.S. Marshals and companies of the National Guard, men who didn't know the local families and who weren't scared of shadows in the night. Arrests were finally made, and the stage was set for a trial that would pit the law of the state against the law of the clan. The county courthouse became the center of a storm. The small town swelled with newspaper reporters from as far away as Cincinnati, with curious onlookers who wanted a glimpse of the monsters, and with the grim-faced families of both the victims and the accused. Armed guards stood on the courthouse roof, their rifles glinting in the sun, a clear sign that this was not ordinary justice. It was a war being fought in a courtroom. Inside, the air was thick with tension and sweat. Every man on the jury knew his decision would follow him home. They knew that no matter what the verdict, they would have to live with the consequences in a land where memories are long and grudges are passed down like heirlooms. The prosecution's case seemed impossible. How could you convict men when every witness was paralyzed by fear? The answer came in the form of a captured white cap, a young man facing the gallows who was offered a deal, his life for his testimony. The dam of silence finally broke. He was brought into the courtroom in chains, and with a trembling hand, he pointed out his former brothers. He named the leaders, described the secret oaths, and recounted the grim details of their night rides. You can just imagine the scene. A man confessing his sins, his voice cracking, while across the room, the men he condemned stared at him with a look of pure, cold hatred that promised a retribution beyond any courtroom's power. The defendants themselves were a portrait of mountain defiance. They weren't cowering criminals. Many of them, particularly the leaders, sat with a quiet, arrogant dignity. They stared back at the jury, not with remorse, but with contempt, as if they were the true judges in the room. In their eyes, they weren't murderers. They were soldiers who had brought order to a lawless land, and this trial was nothing more than a betrayal by the Flatlanders who didn't understand their ways. Their leader, a man known for his cunning and ruthlessness, barely paid attention, projecting an unnerving calm, confident that the web of fear he had spun for years would hold firm. Finally, the jury delivered its verdict. The room held its breath. For the men who were merely followers, the enforcers who carried out the orders, the verdict was guilty. Sentences of life in prison and the hangman's noose were handed down. A quiet wave of relief and victory washed over the prosecution and the families of the victims. But then the jury foreman came to the last name, the mastermind, the man who had orchestrated the entire reign of terror. After a long pause, the words echoed in the stunned silence. Not guilty. A collective gasp filled the room. The architect of it all, protected by intimidated witnesses and a terrified jury, stood up, gave a slight nod to his lawyer, and walked out of the courtroom, a free man, disappearing into the same mountains he had terrorized. Was this justice? A few branches of the poisoned tree had been lopped off, but the root was left untouched, allowed to burrow back into the dark soil. The trial had proven that the law of men could reach into the mountains, but it also showed its limits. It could punish the soldiers, but it couldn't touch the king. For the people who had to go back to their isolated farms, the fear didn't end that day. It just took on a new, more patient form. The Whitecaps were broken as an organization, but their shadow remained, a permanent reminder of a time when justice wore a white hood and innocence was no protection at all. The trials that broke the Whitecaps are now just faded ink in dusty courthouse ledgers. The men who were sent to the gallows have long since turned to dust, their names a footnote in a violent chapter of Kentucky's history. But what of the leader, the man who walked free? He returned to his mountain home and lived out the rest of his days. Officially, he died a peaceful old man in his own bed. But the old-timers in these mountains tell a different story. They say that while the law of men couldn't touch him, the justice of the mountains is patient. They whisper that his final years were haunted by the faces of those he condemned, and that his name, once spoken with fear, is now spoken with a quiet, knowing curse. The scars left by the Whitecaps run deeper than a single generation. To this day, there are family names in those hollows that carry the weight of that time. Descendants of the Whitecaps live alongside the descendants of their victims. The story is a ghost that sits at their dinner tables. For some, it's a source of quiet shame, a dark secret to be kept buried. For others, it's a painful heirloom, a reminder of a resilience forged in terror and loss. The blood feuds may be over, but the memory lingers in the bloodline, a quiet rift that separates neighbor from neighbor even now. You can still find the physical traces of that time if you know where to look. The old county courthouse still stands, its brick walls a silent witness to the drama that unfolded within. On a quiet afternoon, you can almost hear the echoes of the prosecutor's accusations and feel the weight of the jury's fear. Not far from there, in a small, overgrown cemetery, you can find the tombstones of the men the Whitecaps murdered. The weathered inscriptions are simple and direct, telling you the day they were born and the day they died, but they leave out the most important part of the story: how they died and why. The oak tree where the farmer was hanged may or may not still stand, but its legend does, a dark landmark in the collective memory of the community. Most people have forgotten this story. The world has moved on, and the violent nights of the Whitecaps seem like a tale from another world. But the mountains remember. They hold these stories in the deep shadows of their hollows and in the rustle of the leaves on a moonless night. The official histories may have been written, but the true story, the human story of terror, courage, and survival, is preserved in the oral tradition passed down from one generation to the next. It has become a part of the landscape itself, a ghost that walks these hills, reminding us that the past is never truly gone. It's just waiting in the silence to be heard. So we come back to the question we started with, the one that hangs over this entire story like a mountain fog. How did a group of men who only wanted to protect their families become the very monsters they sought to destroy? The answer is as simple as it is terrifying. The Whitecaps weren't born evil. They were created by a vacuum, a space where law and order had died, and something had to take its place. They set out to be the cure, but without any checks on their power, the cure became a poison far deadlier than the disease. They learned that the power to punish is the power to control, and the power to control is the most addictive drug on earth. This isn't just a story about a band of hooded night riders from a bygone era. It's a timeless warning about the darkness that lies dormant in the human heart, waiting for the right circumstances to be unleashed. It's a testament to the fact that the road to hell is truly paved with good intentions. The White Caps are a brutal lesson in how easily the thirst for justice can curdle into a lust for blood, and how the hero who slays the dragon can, in time, grow scales of his own. It's a story of the indomitable Appalachian spirit, yes, but it reveals the dark side of that spirit, a fierce, unforgiving independence that, when twisted, respects no law but its own. The men who wore those white hoods are long gone. The ropes have rotted, and the willow trees they used for their warnings have grown old and died. But the story remains. It's been passed down, whispered from father to son, a chilling bedtime story that just happens to be true. It serves as a permanent reminder, etched into the very soul of these mountains, that the most dangerous men are often those who believe they are doing God's work. They teach us that fear is the cruelest of masters, and that true justice can never, ever be found hiding behind a mask. On a bright May morning in 1866, a young woman named Laura Foster packed a small bundle of clothes, told her father she was running off to be married, and rode her father's mare into the misty folds of the Blue Ridge Mountains. She was supposed to meet her lover, the handsome fiddler and war veteran Tom Dooley. But Laura Foster never arrived at their meeting spot. She was swallowed whole by the wilderness, leaving behind only whispers and a riderless horse that wandered home days later. What happened to Laura Foster on that hillside? Was it a simple crime of passion, the tragic end to a tangled love affair? Or was it something more sinister, a conspiracy of silence, a dark secret protected by an entire mountain community, a truth so twisted it would be immortalized in a folk song that haunts us to this day? Today, we become detectives of the past, sifting through the legends and lies to finally answer the question, who was truly responsible for the crime that created the legend of Tom Dooley? To understand what was lost, you have to understand the world that was. Wilkes County, North Carolina in 1866 was a land of breathtaking beauty and brutal hardship. The Civil War had ripped through these mountains, leaving not just economic ruin, but deep scars on the souls of the men who returned. They came back from the battlefields and prison camps to a world of poverty and uncertainty, their pockets empty and their hearts full of ghosts. This was a place of fierce clan loyalty, where disputes were settled by family and honor was a currency more valuable than cash. The air in these hollows was thick with pride, resentment, and unspoken tensions, a perfect tinderbox waiting for a single, fatal spark. At the center of this world was Laura Foster. By all accounts, she was a simple country girl, known throughout the valley for her striking beauty and a gentle nature. She lived a quiet life on her father's farm, her world defined by the seasons and the hard work of the land. Her dream was a common one, but for her, it was everything. To marry the man she loved, Tom Dooley. She was desperately, foolishly in love. A love so powerful, it blinded her to the dangerous currents swirling just beneath the surface of their lives. She was a wildflower, beautiful and vibrant, unknowingly blooming on the edge of a cliff. Then there was Thomas Dooley, the man they call Tom Dooley. Before the war, he was the prodigal son of the valley, impossibly handsome, a gifted fiddle player whose music could charm the birds from the trees and women into his arms. But the boy who went to fight for the 42nd North Carolina Infantry was not the man who came back. The war and the squalor of a Union prison camp had forged a darkness in him. The easy charm was still there, but it was now laced with a restless, reckless energy. He was a moth drawn to the flame of trouble, and in turn, he was a flame that drew others to their doom. And you cannot tell this story without Ann Melton. Ann was Laura's cousin, a woman of breathtaking beauty and a will of iron. Many believed she was Tom's first and truest love, a bond forged long before the war. While Tom was away, she made a practical choice, marrying an older, stable farmer named James Melton. But her marriage did little to tame the fire she felt for Tom. She was cunning, captivating, and deeply possessive. Anne Melton was the queen of this small, tangled kingdom, and she was not the kind of woman who tolerated rivals. These three lives were knotted together in a web of passion and jealousy that was an open secret in the community. Tom Dooler was courting Laura Foster openly, while just as openly carrying on his affair with the married Anne Melton. It was a dangerous game played in a community where everyone watched and everyone whispered. But even in their quiet lives, a darker shadow was gathering, unseen and unspoken. It was a secret sickness, a shameful disease brought back from the war, and a rumor of a pregnancy that threatened to unravel everything, turning a common love triangle into a matter of life and death. For weeks, the mountains held their secret. The initial search for Laura Foster had turned up nothing but tired men and unanswered prayers. Her father's mare had been found, wandering aimlessly, its saddle empty. As spring turned to summer, a grim silence settled over the valley. It was as if Laura had ridden into the morning mist and been erased from the world. The whispers continued, of course, but without a body, there was no crime, only a heartbreaking disappearance and a community left to wonder. The break in the case didn't come from a lawman's keen eye or a hunter's chance discovery. It came from the fevered ramblings of a woman named Pauline Foster, a cousin to both Laura and Anne, who worked on the Melton farm. Pauline, known to be suffering from the late stages of syphilis, which often rotted the mind, began to have what she called visions. She claimed in moments of strange clarity that she knew where Laura was buried. No one knew whether to believe her ravings, but in the face of a dead-end search, desperation won out. Guided by Pauline's bizarre and unsettling directions, a search party made their way to a lonely, rhododendron-choked hillside. At first, they saw nothing, but then one of the men noticed it. A patch of earth that was slightly sunken, the leaves on top unnaturally disturbed. It was a scar on the landscape that didn't belong. With shovels and grim determination, they began to dig into the soft, dark soil. The stench that rose from the ground told them they had found her before their eyes ever could. What they unearthed was a horror. The body of Laura Foster, wrapped in a blanket, was pulled from the shallow grave. She was badly decomposed after months in the warm earth, but one brutal fact was unmistakable. A single deep wound pierced her chest, a wound made with a large knife, delivered with vicious force. There were no other signs of a struggle, just that one fatal act of violence. The burial was hasty, panicked. This wasn't a calculated execution. It was a desperate attempt to hide a body and a terrible secret. The discovery of the grave didn't bring clarity. It brought a new kind of confusion. The scene spoke of chaos and concealment, but the wilderness offered no easy answers. The only witness was a woman whose testimony was born of sickness and visions. The only real clue was the nature of the wound itself, a clue that pointed toward a man's strength and a man's weapon. The body had been found, but the truth remained buried, and the questions had only just begun to multiply. From the moment Laura Foster's body was pulled from the earth, one name was on everyone's lips: Tom Dooler. Suspicion didn't just fall on him. It crashed down with the weight of inevitability. He was the man she was running away to meet, the last person known to have plans with her. In the tight-knit world of Wilkes County, where everyone knew everyone else's business, the tangled love affair between Tom, Laura, and Anne Melton was common knowledge. Tom was the central figure, the sun around which these women orbited, and when one of them was extinguished, all eyes naturally turned to him. The motive seemed painfully obvious, a story as old as the mountains themselves. The community saw a man trapped between two women, a reckless philanderer who had finally gotten in too deep. The whispers claimed Laura Foster was pregnant with Tom's child, an entanglement that would have forced his hand and ruined his chances with Anne Melton, the woman many believed he truly loved. An even darker rumor circulated that Tom had given Laura a foul disease, syphilis, and she had threatened to expose him, bringing shame and ruin upon them all. In either version of the story, Laura Foster had become a problem, an obstacle to be removed. The circumstantial evidence was damning. The deep, single stab wound in Laura's chest was consistent with the large blade Tom was known to carry, a hunting knife he had brought back from the war. But the most condemning piece of evidence was his own action. As the search for Laura intensified and suspicion began to coil around him, Tom Dula did the one thing an innocent man should never do. He ran. He saddled a horse and fled across the state line into Tennessee, living and working under a false name. This flight was seen by everyone as a confession written across the landscape of two states. Why would an innocent man abandon his home, his family, and his name? To the people of Wilkes County, the answer was simple. He wouldn't. Tom's escape solidified the whispers into a hard, cold certainty. He wasn't just a suspect anymore. He was a fugitive and a murderer. In the court of public opinion, the verdict was already in. But as the shadow of the gallows began to fall over Tom Dula, another, more chilling possibility took root in the minds of the mountain folk. It was a story whispered over hearth fires, a theory that pointed not to the runaway lover, but to the woman at the very center of the storm, Ann Melton. She was Laura's own cousin, the woman who shared her bloodline and her lover. No one was closer to the heart of the tragedy, and many began to wonder if she wasn't the heart of the crime itself. The motive was primal and powerful, a jealousy so fierce it could curdle blood. Ann Melton was not a woman who shared. She was Tom's first love, and in her mind, his only true love. The news that he was planning to elope with Laura would have been more than a heartbreak. It would have been a profound betrayal, a public humiliation she could not endure. In the unforgiving code of the mountains, this was an offense that demanded a reckoning. The legend suggests that Anne, a woman scorned, decided that if she couldn't have Tom, no one would. Laura Foster wasn't just a rival. She was a testament to Anne's failure to hold her man, and she had to be erased. With this new suspicion, people began to re-examine the facts. The star witness, Pauline Foster, who had the convenient visions that led to the body, where did she live and work? On Ann Melton's farm. She was under Anne's roof, subject to her influence and her will every single day. Was it truly a supernatural vision that led Pauline to the grave, or was it a carefully planted suggestion from a manipulative mistress, a calculated move to have the body found only after Tom Dula was long gone and suspicion had hardened against him? Suddenly, Anne's behavior after the disappearance seemed less like that of a concerned cousin and more like that of a cold, calculating conspirator. Her composure was seen as unnatural, her lack of public grief suspicious. The very legal maneuvering that separated her trial from Tom's, once seen as a procedural matter, now looked like a deliberate tactic to keep her off the witness stand and prevent her from being questioned under oath. The community started to see not a woman caught in a tragedy, but a puppeteer pulling the strings from the shadows. The theory that began to form was as simple as it was terrifying. Anne had killed Laura in a fit of jealous rage, and Tom, arriving to find the horrifying deed done, made a fateful choice out of love and loyalty to protect her and take the blame himself. But there was another power at play in these hills, one older and more relentless than a lover's jealousy or a man's guilt. It was the silent, brooding force of the Foster clan itself. In the world of Appalachia, family was everything. It was law, government, and army all rolled into one. The Fosters were a proud and numerous clan, their roots sunk deep into the rocky soil of Wilkes County. To dishonor one was to dishonor them all, and what had happened to Laura was the ultimate dishonor. Their motive was not simple grief. It was a cold, burning rage against the shame that had been brought upon their name. Tom Dula, the charming outsider who had seduced their daughter, allegedly gotten her pregnant, and was the man she died with, was a walking monument to their family's humiliation. Whether he struck the fatal blow or not was almost secondary. He was the source of the rot, the cause of the scandal that was now the talk of 3 counties. They needed more than justice. They needed a cleansing. And for that, blood had to be paid. This created a climate of quiet, immense pressure. It's a theory whispered to this day that the Fosters, realizing they might never get the satisfaction of seeing the clever Anne Melton convicted in a court of law, decided to wage their own war in the shadows. They began to shape the narrative through social pressure and communal expectation. Witnesses who might have spoken of Anne's volatile temper or seen her near the scene found it easier to stay silent. Rumors that pointed away from Tom were mysteriously quashed, while those that implicated him grew louder and more detailed with every telling. Pauline Foster, the key witness, was caught in the middle of this storm. Was she just Anne Melton's pawn, or was she also a member of the Foster clan, being urged by her own kin to point the finger where it would do the most good for the family's honor? In this version of the story, the tragedy was no longer just a crime of passion. It was a battle between a lone man and an entire clan, a clan that had decided, with or without a court, that Tom Dooler was the one who had to hang. With Laura Foster's body discovered, and Tom Dooler a fugitive, the investigation snapped into a singular, frantic focus: the manhunt. The law in those days wasn't a team of detectives meticulously gathering forensic evidence. It was a posse of determined men on horseback, driven by a raw sense of mountain justice. Led by former Wilkes County Sheriff William Dooler, a relative of Tom's, they picked up the trail. But Tom Dooler was a child of these mountains. He had a considerable head start, and the wilderness was his greatest ally. He vanished into the green labyrinth of the Appalachians like a ghost into the fog. For weeks, the posse tracked him through the rugged peaks and dense forests that straddled the border of North Carolina and Tennessee. The mountains themselves seemed to conspire to hide him, offering up 1,000 false trails, 100 hidden hollows where a man could disappear for years. Every snapped twig that wasn't his, every cold campfire that belonged to a hunter, was a dead end that cost the posse precious time. The pursuit was a grueling testament to the land's indifference. It was a place that could just as easily protect a fugitive as it could swallow a victim. The trail grew cold, and it seemed as though Tom Dooler had succeeded, that he had been consumed by the wilderness he knew so well. It wasn't until a legendary mountain lawman, Colonel James Grayson, got word that a man matching Tom's description was working as a farmhand near the Tennessee border that the chase had its break. Grayson and the posse cornered Tom, who gave himself up without a fight. They had their man. To the outside world, this seemed to be the end of it. The promising lead hadn't evaporated, it had been captured. But this capture was its own kind of false trail. It provided an easy answer, a simple villain, and in doing so, it slammed the door on any other line of inquiry. With Tom in custody, no one seriously investigated Anne Melton. Her convenient alibi, provided by her own farmhands, was accepted without much question. The possibility of another party being involved, a drifter or a rival unknown to the community, was never explored. The entire weight of the state's investigation was now focused on building a case against the man they had chased across the mountains. This created a deep and growing frustration. They had their killer, but the evidence was flimsy, built on circumstance, motive, and his flight. They had no murder weapon, no confession, and their star witness was a woman whose mind was crumbling from disease. The community, which had craved a swift and certain resolution, was left with a captive but no real closure. The single-minded pursuit of Tom Dooler had felt like a straight path to justice, but it had led them to a dead end, with the suspect in chains and the truth still hiding somewhere back in the mountain mists. When the lawmen brought Tom Dooler back to Wilkes County in chains, they believed the hardest part was over. They were wrong. As they began to build their case, they ran into a wall, not a wall of brick and mortar, but of downcast eyes, tight-lipped mouths, and sudden, convenient deafness. Neighbors who had known the families for generations suddenly saw nothing. Men who drank with Tom at the local tavern heard nothing. Women who quilted with Anne and Laura knew nothing. The mountain had drawn a breath and held it, wrapping itself in a thick, impenetrable code of silence. This silence was born of a deep and primal fear. Anne Melton cast a long, cold shadow over the community. The whispers that she was the true killer were pervasive, and with those whispers came a chilling question. If she was capable of stabbing her own cousin in a jealous rage, what would she do to a neighbor who dared to speak against her? Her husband, James Melton, was a respected and established farmer. To accuse his wife was to make a powerful enemy. It was a risk no one was willing to take. Self-preservation was a lesson the mountains taught well, and it often meant keeping your mouth shut and your eyes on your own affairs. But the silence was more complex than simple fear. It was also a matter of tangled loyalties. The Doulas, the Fosters, the Meltons, these families were all interwoven by blood and marriage, a complex tapestry of kinship that stretched back generations. To testify against Anne or Tom was not just to accuse an individual, it was to draw a line in the sand between families, to risk a feud that could simmer for generations, passed down like a rusty rifle. Faced with the choice of speaking to outside lawmen from Statesville or maintaining the fragile peace within their own clan, the people of Wilkes County chose their own. The cost of breaking this code was made terrifyingly clear. An old story, told for 100 years, speaks of a woman who lived on the trail Laura Foster had taken. She let it be known that she might have seen Anne Melton walking towards the meeting spot on that fateful morning. A few nights later, her barn burned to the ground in a blaze that lit up the hollow. No one was ever caught, but the message was as clear as the fire itself. Keep silent, or what you own will turn to ash. After that, the whispers died, and the silence became absolute. The community understood. The price of the truth was too high. For nearly 2 years, the case against Tom Doula was a frustrating stalemate built on whispers and circumstance. His first trial ended in a guilty verdict, but it was overturned on appeal. A second trial was underway, and his brilliant lawyer, former Governor Zebulon Vance, was systematically dismantling the prosecution's flimsy case. He had painted Pauline Foster as a delusional, unreliable witness and pointed the finger of blame squarely at the calculating Anne Melton. It began to look as if Tom Doula, despite the mountain of public opinion against him, might just walk free. The truth seemed destined to remain buried, a secret lost to the silence of the hills. The turning point didn't come from a dramatic courtroom revelation or a newly discovered piece of evidence. It came from a slip of paper, a desperate note scrawled in a jail cell. As his second trial drew to a close and the possibility of acquittal seemed within reach, Tom Doula did something inexplicable. He took a pencil and a scrap of paper and wrote 4 simple, devastating words. I and Anne Melton. He passed this note to one of his lawyers, a cryptic and ambiguous message that could be interpreted in a dozen different ways. Was it a confession? A last-ditch effort to implicate the woman he felt had betrayed him? Or was it, as many have come to believe, the key to a hidden truth? The most enduring theory is that this note was Tom's attempt to articulate a complex reality, that he and Anne Melton were both involved, but not in the way anyone suspected. The note wasn't a confession of murder, but a confession of conspiracy. It was his way of saying that the plan had never been to kill Laura, but for Tom and Anne to run away together, and that Laura had somehow gotten caught in the crossfire of their own desperate escape plan. This tiny, forgotten clue, preserved in the state archives, throws the entire accepted narrative into chaos. It suggests a truth far more complicated than a simple love triangle murder. It points not to a lone killer, but to a shared plot, a pact between 2 lovers that went horribly wrong. The note changes everything. It reframes Tom's flight not as the act of a guilty murderer, but as the panicked escape of a man caught in a catastrophe of his own making. It was the moment the legend cracked, revealing a deeper, darker and more tragic story beneath the surface. The trial was no longer just about who killed Laura Foster. It was about unraveling the true nature of the pact between Tom Dooler and Ann Melton. The courtroom in Statesville held its breath. Governor Vance's powerful defense had cast a deep and profound doubt on the state's case. Tom Dooler, the man everyone had condemned, now seemed like a victim himself, a pawn in a game played by a far more cunning mind. Acquittal felt not just possible, but likely. It was in this moment of rising hope that Tom Dooler's own hand sealed his fate. The cryptic note, "I and Ann Melton," was seen by the jury not as a complex clue, but as a simple, damning confession of partnership. The ambiguity that Tom may have intended was lost. The prosecution finally had the link they needed. But the jury's verdict is not the end of this story. For the true unmasking didn't happen under the authority of a judge, but in the enduring judgment of the mountain people, a verdict whispered from one generation to the next. And in that court, the true killer was, and always has been, Ann Melton. She was the dark heart of the tragedy, the hand that held the knife. She was the architect of Laura Foster's death and Tom Dooler's downfall. Tom's note was not a confession of his own guilt in the murder, but his last, desperate attempt to point towards hers without fully betraying the woman he still inexplicably loved. He couldn't bring himself to write the words "Ann killed her," but he could link their names together in the crime, a final, futile gesture towards a truth he knew would be buried with him. He was admitting his part in the conspiracy of silence, in the cover-up, and in the tragic aftermath, hoping someone would see the truth between the lines. Her motive was a poison as old as humanity itself, a possessive, all-consuming jealousy. Ann Melton had shared Tom Dooler, but she had never accepted